Chapter 1. Born in the Ashes. The story of Johnny Silverhand doesn't begin with chrome and glory, with screaming guitars and burning towers. It begins quietly, painfully, in the fading light of a world coming apart at the seams. It begins with a child named Robert John Linder, born on November 6, 1988 in College Station, Texas, a small city that would mean nothing in the grand sweep of history, but which produced a man who would help burn the world. This was an America in twilight, though few recognized it yet. The nation was crumbling under the weight of economic collapse, drowning in debt and dysfunction. The mega corporations were rising like new gods, their towers casting shadows across the dying dreams of ordinary people. The social contract that had held American society together for generations was dissolving, replaced by something darker and more predatory. The American dream. That promise that hard work and virtue would be rewarded, that your children would live better than you did, had become a cruel joke, a lie told by the powerful to keep the powerless compliant. In the streets, martial law was becoming normal. The police had transformed from public servants into corporate enforcers, protecting property rights while human rights withered. Food scarcity was common. Violence was endemic. The comfortable middle-class existence that had defined the post-war era was evaporating, leaving only the very rich and the struggling masses. Robert John Linder was born into this latter category, into a world that had already decided he didn't matter. His father was a military man, career soldier, disciplinarian, believer in the old order even as it collapsed around him. Robert's earliest memories were of rigid structure, of expectations and consequences, of a father who had survived wars and believed that discipline was the foundation of survival. The Linder household ran like a military unit, with schedules and rules and consequences for deviation. For young Robert, it was normal. He knew nothing else. But normalcy in those years was a fragile thing, easily shattered. The riots that swept through American cities in the early 1990s were spontaneous eruptions of rage. People who had been pushed too far, who had lost too much, who had finally realized that the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed, just not for them. These weren't organized political movements or coordinated revolutions. They were pure chaos, pure fury, communities tearing themselves apart because there was nothing left to lose. Robert's father died in one of these riots, not as a hero, not in combat, not defending anything meaningful. He was simply in the wrong place when the violence erupted, caught in the crossfire between desperate citizens and militarized police. He became a statistic, a casualty number, another body in the street. Robert was 6 years old when they came to tell his mother. 6 years old, then he learned that the world was fundamentally random and cruel, that goodness and discipline and following the rules meant nothing and the structure itself was collapsing. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Robert's mother couldn't hold the family together alone. Maybe she tried. Records are unclear, and Johnny himself never spoke much about this period. But within months, young Robert found himself on the streets, abandoned or lost or simply released into a world that had no infrastructure left to catch falling children. The social safety nets had been cut. The foster care system was overwhelmed and underfunded. The churches and charities were drowning in similar cases. Robert John Linder, age 6, learned to survive alone in America's dying cities. The details of those street years are fragmentary, pieced together from throwaway comments Johnny made decades later, usually when drunk or high or in the grip of some particularly dark mood. He lived in abandoned buildings, in the ruins of the old world. He learned to avoid the gangs that controlled most urban territory, learned which corners were safe and which meant death. He learned to steal without being caught, to fight when necessary, to run when fighting was futile. He learned, most importantly, that no one was coming to save him. That the adults had failed, that the system had failed, that the promises were all lies. This knowledge, burned into him before he was even 10 years old, would shape everything that came after. Johnny Silverhand's rage at authority, at corporate power, at the comfortable lies people told themselves, all of it traced back to these years when he was a child alone in the ruins, invisible to everyone who mattered. Salvation, when it came, arrived in an unexpected form. A nomad family, one of the wandering clans that had rejected urban society entirely, passed through the area where Robert was surviving. They found him, half-starved and sick, digging through garbage behind a collapsed shopping center. They could have left him. Many would have. But something in the boy's defiant glare, in his refusal to beg or plead, caught their attention. The nomads took him in, not out of charity, but out of recognition. Here was a survivor, someone who had the fundamental hardness necessary to endure in a world without mercy. They brought him into their convoy, into their wandering community of vehicles and temporary camps, and they taught him the skills that would later define his life. From the nomads, Robert learned to shoot. Not for sport, not for recreation, but for survival and food. He learned to handle weapons with the casual competence of someone who understood that a gun was just a tool, no more inherently good or evil than a hammer or a knife. By age 10, he could field strip and reassemble a rifle in darkness, could compensate for wind and distance, could shoot to kill without hesitation when necessary. But he also learned to play guitar. This might seem incongruous in a world of scarcity and violence. Why waste time on music? But the nomads understood something essential about human survival, that people need beauty as much as they need food, that art and music and story are what separate us from mere animals struggling in the dirt. Around campfires in the wasteland, while engines cooled and guards watched for raiders, the nomads would play music. Old songs and new, folk ballads and punk rage. Acoustic guitars passed from hand to hand. Robert discovered he had a talent for it. More than talent, he had need for it. When he played, something in him quieted. The anger and fear and loss that churned constantly in his chest would recede, channeled into the music, transformed into something that could be shared rather than suffered alone. The guitar became his second language, more honest than words, more direct than violence. This duality, rifle and the guitar, destruction and creation, violence and beauty, would define Robert John Linder for the rest of his life. He could kill a man at 300 yards and then play a melody that would make grown adults weep. He could strip a weapon and tune a guitar with equal facility. He was being forged into something the old world had no name for, something that could only exist in the chaos of the collapsing order. The nomad years should have been his salvation, his chance to find family and purpose outside the failed cities. But Robert carried too much damage, too much rage that couldn't be entirely channeled into music. He was a survivor, but he was also fundamentally alone, incapable of the trust and vulnerability that real community required. The incident that ended his time with the Nomads was sordid and stupid and entirely predictable in hindsight. A girl, a rival, a confrontation that escalated faster than anyone expected. The details vary depending on who tells the story, but the outcome is consistent. Robert killed another young nomad in a fight over a romantic dispute. Whether it was self-defense or murder, whether he was justified or not, became irrelevant in the face of nomad justice. Blood had been spilled within the family. The clan's equilibrium was shattered. Robert, barely into his teenage years, had to flee once again. But this time, he was hunted, not just by the dead boy's relatives seeking vengeance, but by his own guilt, by the knowledge that he had destroyed the only stability he'd found since his father's death. He ran east, stealing vehicles when he could, hitching rides when necessary, moving through the increasingly militarized landscape of turn-of-the-millennium America. He was exhausted, traumatized, alone, and most dangerously, beginning to believe that violence was the only language he truly spoke fluently. At 16 years old, Robert John Linder made the choice that would ultimately lead him to Johnny Silverhand, to Cunningham, to the nuclear fire that would consume Night City. He walked into a military recruitment office and signed his life away. The recruiters saw what the system always saw in boys like Robert: disposable cannon fodder, cheap labor for the forever wars being fought for corporate profit in distant countries. They gave him papers to sign, promises of education and purpose and belonging. They gave him a uniform and a number and sent him to basic training, where drill sergeants would strip away whatever remained of his identity and rebuild him as a weapon in human form. Robert went willingly, even eagerly. He had nowhere else to go, no other options. The military promised structure, purpose, and most seductively, the chance to direct his violence outward rather than inward. He could kill for his country, could transform his rage into patriotism, could believe that his father's death in those riots had meant something, that the system was worth defending after all. It was perhaps the last innocent belief he would ever hold. The Central American jungles would burn that innocence away completely, leaving only the chrome and the fury that would become Johnny Silverhand. Chapter 2: The Green Hell. Basic training broke Robert down and rebuilt him, as it was designed to do. They shaved his head, stripped away his name, reduced him to a serial number and a role in the machine. The drill instructor screamed in his face, testing him for weakness, for hesitation, for any sign that he couldn't be trusted to follow orders when bullets started flying. Robert endured it all with the same grim determination that had carried him through the streets and the nomad camps. He had survived worse. He could survive this. What surprised him was that he excelled. The rifle skills the nomads had taught him translated directly to military marksmanship. His scores on the range were exceptional, drawing attention from instructors who specialized in identifying potential assets. The hardness that other recruits were struggling to develop was already burned into Robert's core. He didn't need to be taught to kill. He already understood that violence was sometimes necessary for survival. He just needed to be pointed in the right direction. By the time he completed training, Robert John Linder had become exactly what the military wanted: a weapon that could think, a killer who could follow orders, a young man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. They assigned him to an infantry unit being deployed to Central America, gave him a rifle and body armor that wouldn't stop much, and shipped him south into the green hell that would destroy whatever remained of his faith in the American system. The early thousands found the United States mired in what official documentation called the Central American Conflict, though veterans knew it by other names: the Second Central American War, the corporate jungle, the green meat grinder. On paper, American forces were there to combat drug cartels and communist insurgents, to bring stability and democracy to a troubled region. The politicians spoke eloquently about American interests and strategic importance, about spreading freedom and opposing tyranny. Robert learned the truth within his first week in country. The transport that carried his unit into Nicaragua flew over vast plantations protected by American troops, over pipelines that snaked through the jungle under military guard, over mining operations where corporate logos were more prominent than American flags. The mission briefing spoke of securing strategic assets, protecting American business interests, establishing zones of control. The insurgents they were fighting weren't ideological communists. They were farmers and villagers who objected to having their land seized, their water polluted, their communities destroyed to extract resources for distant corporations. This was a corporate war, orchestrated by what soldiers cynically called the Gang of Four: NSA, CIA, FBI, and DEA, working in concert with mega corporations to secure resources and test new technologies on living subjects. The military was providing security for corporate extraction operations, using American soldiers as private security forces for companies that paid no taxes and felt no loyalty to the nation whose flag they hid behind. Robert watched as his unit was ordered to clear villages to make way for pipeline construction. He participated in operations where the primary objective was protecting corporate facilities rather than American lives. He saw his commanding officers take orders from men in expensive suits who had never worn a uniform. Corporate representatives who treated soldiers like expendable equipment, resources to be used and discarded. But the true horror, the revelation that would poison Robert's soul forever, was what the military was doing to its own soldiers. The biotechnical corporations and cybernetics manufacturers had formed partnerships with the Department of Defense, agreements that gave them access to combat zones as testing grounds for experimental technologies. Soldiers were being used as guinea pigs for combat drugs that enhanced performance at unknown long-term cost. Men were being fitted with prototype cybernetics after injuries, implants that hadn't been properly tested, augmentations that sometimes worked and sometimes drove their recipients insane. Robert's unit included several soldiers with experimental modifications. Davis had a targeting system wired into his optic nerve that gave him perfect accuracy but caused him splitting headaches and occasional hallucinations. Martinez had been given a chemical cocktail after a minor injury that was supposed to accelerate healing. Instead, it was slowly destroying his liver and kidneys. Williams had received a prototype arm replacement that worked beautifully until the firmware glitched and locked his limb in place during a firefight, nearly getting him killed. The soldiers called these experiments corpo guinea pig programs, and they learned to fear injury not because of the wounds themselves, but because of what would be done to them in the field hospitals. The corporation saw soldiers as perfect test subjects, desperate for anything that might give them an edge in combat. Already signed over to government control, expendable if the experiments went wrong. Robert watched his brothers in arms slowly transformed into cyborg experiments, saw them struggling with systems that weren't ready for deployment, heard them screaming in their sleep as experimental neuralware misfired in their brains. He swore to himself that he would never accept augmentation, that he would stay human even if it meant being less effective in combat. It was perhaps the last promise he would make to himself before circumstances made it impossible to keep. The defining trauma of Robert Linder's life occurred 6 months into his deployment, in the mud and blood and screaming chaos of an ambush in the Nicaraguan jungle. His unit was on patrol, moving through dense vegetation along a trail that intelligence had assured them was secure. Intelligence was wrong, or lying, or operating on information that was days old and worthless in a guerrilla war. The ambush was perfectly executed. Insurgents hidden in the canopy, in the undergrowth, in spider holes they dug weeks earlier in anticipation of exactly this moment. The first explosion caught the point man, shredding him instantly. Then the world became fire and noise and horror. Automatic weapons fire tore through the jungle, bullets snapping through leaves and bark and flesh with equal indifference. Men were screaming for medics, for their mothers, for God, for death to take them quickly. The jungle, which had been oppressively quiet moments before, became a cacophony of violence. Robert dropped into cover, returning fire at muzzle flashes, operating on training and instinct. Time became strange, simultaneously crawling and racing. He saw Davis take a round through the throat, watched the man who had complained about his experimental targeted system clutch at the arterial spray, drowning in his own blood. He saw Martinez catch fire when a grenade landed in his position, the experimental chemicals in his system igniting and burning him from the inside out. The unit was being decimated. They were pinned down, outmaneuvered, dying in the mud thousands of miles from home for a war that had nothing to do with freedom or democracy, or any of the noble words they'd been sold. That's when Robert saw the RPG, a guerrilla fighter emerging from concealment, the rocket-propelled grenade launcher on his shoulder, aiming directly at Robert's position. Time seemed to stop. Robert could see the man's finger tightening on the trigger, could calculate the trajectory, could understand with perfect clarity that in the next second he would be vaporized. Then someone slammed into him from the side, driving him out of his cover an instant before the rocket hit. The explosion was everything: light and heat and pressure and sound, the universe itself tearing apart. Robert felt himself lifted and thrown, felt debris and shrapnel tearing through the air. He landed hard, his ears ringing, his vision blurred, his body screaming at him that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. It took him several seconds to realize that his left arm was gone. Not wounded, not broken, gone. Torn away at the shoulder by the explosion, reduced to a ragged stump that was pumping blood into the jungle soil at an alarming rate. The pain hadn't hit yet, his body in shock, his mind unable to process the reality of what had happened. He stared at the place where his arm had been, watched his blood darkening the mud, and felt something in his psyche break cleanly in half. Next to him, in a crater still smoking from the explosion, was the body of Private James Chen. Chen had been Robert's closest friend in the unit, a kid from San Francisco who had joined the military for the same reason Robert had: nowhere else to go, nothing else to do, no future visible in civilian life. They had bonded over their shared cynicism, their growing understanding that they were pawns in a game being played by people who saw them as expendable. Chen had been planning to desert after his deployment ended, had talked about disappearing into Night City, starting over somewhere the corporations couldn't find him. Chen had seen the RPG, had tackled Robert out of the blast radius, and had taken the worst of the explosion himself. His body was torn apart, barely recognizable as human. He had died instantly, saving Robert's life without hesitation, sacrificing himself for a friend. Robert stared at Chen's corpse and felt the last of his innocence die in that jungle clearing. The medics found him minutes or hours later. Time had stopped meaning anything. They tied a tourniquet above the stump of his arm, pumped him full of morphine and antibiotics, and evacuated him to a field hospital. Robert floated in and out of consciousness during the transport, his mind fragmenting under the weight of trauma and shock and survivor's guilt. Why had Chen died instead of him? What made Robert's life worth saving? Why was he alive and so many others, Davis, Martinez, Williams, Chen, all the others, were dead or dying? He had no answers, only the crushing weight of unearned survival, the knowledge that he was alive by pure chance, by the sacrifice of someone better than him. He woke in the field hospital to find a surgeon standing over him, explaining in a calm, professional voice that they had managed to stabilize him, that the amputation was clean, that he was being recommended for a medical discharge and a cybernetic replacement. Robert tried to refuse, remembered his promise to stay human, to resist the corporal transformation of flesh into product. But the doctor explained, with the same calm professionalism, that refusal wasn't really an option. The military had protocols. The augmentation was covered by his service contract. The prosthetic was already being shipped from the manufacturer. He could accept it voluntarily, or it could be mandated as part of his recovery protocol. They gave him 48 hours to think about it. Robert spent those hours in a morphine haze, staring at the empty space where his arm had been, thinking about Chen's sacrifice, about the corporate logos he'd seen on military equipment, about the war that had taken his flesh and was now claiming the right to replace it with chrome. In the end, he consented, not because he wanted it, but because he understood that he had no real choice. The system owned him. They had always owned him. He had signed his life away the moment he walked into that recruitment office, had traded his autonomy for structure and purpose, and the promise of belonging. The surgery took 6 hours. When Robert woke, his left arm was chrome, smooth, perfect, powerful, and utterly alien. The manufacturer was listed in small print near the shoulder joint, a subsidiary of Arasaka Corporation. His arm, his body, was now literally corporate property, a product installed in his flesh, a constant reminder that he belonged to the machine. The prosthetic worked flawlessly. It was stronger than flesh, more precise, capable of interfacing with weapon systems and data ports. The technicians assured him he would adapt quickly, that most recipients grew to prefer their augmentations to their original limbs. Robert hated it with every fiber of his being. Every time he looked at that gleaming chrome hand, he saw Chen's torn body. He saw the corporations that had orchestrated the war, that had used soldiers as test subjects, that had taken his flesh and replaced it with their product. He saw the fundamental truth of his existence. He was no longer entirely human. He was a hybrid thing, part man and part machine, and the machine part belonged to the people who had killed his friends for profit. The revelation of government corruption and the utter futility of the war was triggering mass desertions by the time Robert was declared fit for duty. Soldiers were fleeing in record numbers, stealing vehicles and weapons, disappearing into the countryside or making their way back to the States without authorization. The military was struggling to maintain discipline, threatening courts-martial and execution for desertion. But the threats rang hollow when entire units were abandoning their posts. Robert made his decision the night before he was supposed to return to active duty. He stole a jeep from the motor pool, packed whatever supplies he could carry, and drove north through the jungle darkness. He was a deserter now, a criminal, but he no longer cared. The military had taken everything from him, his innocence, his friends, his flesh, and had given him nothing but trauma and chrome in return. He drove for 3 days, avoiding military checkpoints, bribing border guards, moving through the chaos of a collapsing occupation. Other deserters waved to him on the roads, a loose fraternity of men who had seen too much and refused to die for corporate profit margins. Some talked about fighting back, about exposing what had been done to them, about bringing down the system that had chewed them up and spit them out. Robert said nothing, just kept driving north. He crossed into Texas and kept going, heading west toward the only place in America where you could truly disappear, where the corporations ruled openly and the old laws no longer applied. He drove until the Jeep ran out of fuel somewhere in Arizona, then hitchhiked the rest of the way, his chrome arm hidden under a jacket, his military identification burned in a campfire. Robert John Linder arrived in Night City 3 weeks later, broken in body and spirit, a deserter with nothing but trauma and rage, and a chrome arm that reminded him every second of what had been taken from him. He found a cheap hotel in Pacifica, paid for a month in advance with what remained of his military pay, and locked himself inside to begin the slow process of destroying himself with alcohol and synthetic drugs. It would be months before Johnny Silverhand emerged from that hotel room. The man who had been Robert Linder was dying, drowning in survivor's guilt and PTSD and the crushing weight of understand what the world really was. Something else was being born in his place. Something harder and angrier and capable of the grand gestures that would eventually light Night City on fire. Chapter 3. Rebirth in Chrome. Pacifica in the early 2000s was a district of broken promises. The developers had envisioned a resort paradise, gleaming hotels and pristine beaches that would attract tourists with disposable income. But the money had dried up halfway through construction, leaving skeletal buildings and half-finished infrastructure. What remained was claimed by squatters, gangs, and people who had fallen through society's cracks. It was the perfect place to disappear. Robert's hotel was called the Sunset Paradise, though it had never seen paradise, and the only sunsets visible from its grimy windows were obscured by smog and the hulking ruins of abandoned construction projects. The owner was a woman named Rosa, a former corporal drone who had escaped her contract and now survived by renting rooms to people who paid in cash and asked no questions. She looked at Robert's chrome arm when he checked in, saw the military-issue design, and simply nodded. She had seen plenty of deserters. They all ended up in places like this eventually. The room was small, a mattress on the floor, a bathroom with rust-stained fixtures, a window that overlooked an alley where street dealers conducted their business. Robert paid for a month, locked the door behind him, and began the process of systematic self-destruction. The first week he barely moved. He lay on the mattress staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the ambush in an endless loop. He would see Chen's body torn apart, would feel the phantom pain of his missing arm, would wake from fevered dreams convinced he was still in the jungle, with bullets snapping through the air. The chrome arm lay beside him, disconnected from his nervous system through sheer force of will. He couldn't make it stop working. Neural interface was too well designed, but he could ignore it, could treat it as a foreign object attached to his body rather than a part of himself. The second week, he discovered the bar 3 blocks away, a place called Johnny's, an irony he wouldn't appreciate until later. The bartender was an old man named Takeshi, who had lost most of his customers when the corpo money left Pacifica. He served cheap synthetic alcohol to the handful of regulars who still had enough eddies to drink away their problems. Robert became one of them, spending his dwindling military pay on bottles of whiskey that tasted like industrial solvent and burned like acid going down. Takeshi didn't ask questions, but he was observant. He watched Robert drink alone night after night, watched the young man's hand shake as he poured another glass, watched him stare at his chrome arm with undisguised hatred. On the 10th night, Takeshi broke his usual silence. "Military?" Robert looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. He nodded. "Desert or discharge? Does it matter?" Takeshi shrugged, wiping down the bar with a cloth that had seen better days. "Not really. They both end up here eventually. The ones who couldn't stop seeing what they'd seen. The ones who came back and found there was no back to come to." Robert said nothing, but he kept drinking at Johnny's. Takeshi's tacit understanding was more comfort than actual comfort would have been. The old man had seen it all before. 1,000-yard stare, the survivor's guilt, the slow drowning in alcohol and regret. The third week, Robert discovered synth coke and the particular oblivion it offered. A dealer in the alley behind the Sunset Paradise, a kid who couldn't have been more than 16, already cybered up with cheap street augments, sold him a baggie of white powder that promised to make everything feel distant and manageable. The high was electric, artificial, a chemical escape that let Robert's mind disconnect from his body's trauma. For a few hours, he could forget Chen, forget Nicaragua, forget the chrome weight of his arm, but the come down was proportionally brutal. The crash left him hollow, his serotonin depleted, his dopamine receptors screaming for more. He would lie on his mattress, sweating and shaking, convinced that insects were crawling under his skin, that the chrome arm was spreading through his body, that he was becoming more machine than man. Rosa found him during one of these crashes, convulsing on his floor, his chrome hand gouging marks in the concrete as his nervous system misfired. She called a Ripperdoc, an underground cybernetic specialist named Victor, who worked out of a clinic in the same building. Victor stabilized Robert, flushed his system, and delivered a lecture about the dangers of mixing military-grade neural implants with street drugs. That arm is connected to your entire nervous system. Victor explained, his voice carrying the weary patience of someone who had given this speech many times before. When you flood your brain with synthetics, you're not just affecting your organic tissues, you're affecting the interface. You could fry your neural pathways, lock up the prosthetic, or worse, give yourself permanent brain damage. Robert, still trembling from the crash, looked at the Ripperdoc with eyes that held more death wish than fear. Maybe that would be better. Victor studied him for a long moment. You're not the first soldier I've seen come back like this. Full of guilt, full of rage, trying to die slowly because you can't bring yourself to do it quickly. But let me tell you something. Chen, or whoever it was that died for you, didn't sacrifice himself so you could waste away in a Pacifica flophouse. The use of Chen's name, Robert had been muttering it during his delirium, cut through the fog. You don't know anything about it. No, Victor agreed, but I know that right now you're insulting his memory. He died believing your life was worth saving. You might want to consider proving him right. The words haunted Robert through the fourth week. He cut back on the drugs, though not the alcohol. That crutch remained necessary. He started leaving his room during daylight hours, walking the broken streets of Pacifica, observing the city that had become his refuge. Night City in 2003 was a study in contrasts. Corporate towers gleamed in the city center, monuments to power and wealth that seemed to pierce the sky itself. But at street level, in neighborhoods like Pacifica, the reality was different. The city was divided into corporate zones and free zones, areas where law mattered and areas where only power mattered. The police were corporate security with a government contract, protecting property and profit while ordinary citizens navigated gang territories and corporate exploitation. Robert watched the street samurai, mercenaries, and criminals with extensive cybernetic modification move through Pacifica with casual confidence. He saw full conversion Borgs, people who had replaced so much of their body with machinery that they barely qualified as human anymore. He saw brain dance addicts, their minds fried by too many hours in virtual reality, begging for eddies to buy another hit of someone else's experiences. Most relevantly, he saw the musicians. Street performers were everywhere in Pacifica. Played for tips, their music carrying over the noise of traffic, construction, and violence. Some played acoustic, old folk songs and protest ballads. Others had electric guitars running on portable amps, played thrash metal and punk rock that spoke to the rage of a generation with no future. The music was raw, unpolished, angry, and it called to something deep in Robert's damaged psyche. He remembered the guitar the nomads had taught him to play, remembered how the music had quieted the constant chaos in his mind. He found a pawn shop, run by a man missing most of his face to combat burns, and he traded his military knife, only weapon he had carried from Nicaragua, for a battered acoustic guitar with 2 strings missing. Back in his room at the Sunset Paradise, Robert restrung the guitar and began to play. His chrome fingers were too strong at first, breaking strings, unable to find the subtle pressure needed for proper technique. But he persisted, learning to modulate the prosthetic strength to make the artificial hand work with the organics in creating something beautiful. The music that came out was different from what the nomads had played. It was harder, angrier, infused with Nicaragua and Chen's sacrifice, and the chrome weight of his arm. He played until his organic hand bled, until Rosa pounded on the wall telling him to shut up, until the other residents of the Sunset Paradise started gathering in the hallway outside his door to listen. One night a woman knocked. Her name was Bess, though she went by Nancy then, and she played keyboards in a band that was looking for a guitarist. She had heard Robert play through the walls for weeks and wanted to know if he was interested in auditioning. Robert's first instinct was to refuse. He wasn't a performer, wasn't trying to be part of anything. He just needed the music to keep the memories at bay. But Nancy was persistent, and something in her intensity reminded him of the nomads who had refused to leave him dying behind a shopping center. She wasn't asking. She was insisting that he mattered, that his music mattered, that his life could be more than slow suicide in a Pacifica flophouse. The audition took place in a garage that doubled as a practice space for a dozen different underground bands. Nancy's group was called Tempest at the time, a forgettable name for a band that hadn't found its identity yet. The drummer was Denny, a woman with arms covered in tattoos depicting historical revolutionaries. The bassist was Henry, quiet and technical, who let his play do his talking. And then there was Carrie Uridine. Carrie was everything Robert wasn't: confident, charismatic, comfortable in his own skin despite the chaos around him. He played guitar and sang, his voice rough but compelling, his stage presence magnetic even in an empty garage. When Robert walked in carrying his beat-up acoustic, Carrie sized him up in seconds, saw the military posture, the chrome arm, the damaged eyes, and smiled. "You're the one Nancy's been talking about, the guy who plays like he's trying to exorcise demons." Robert said nothing. Just plugged his guitar into an amp. "Let's see what you've got," Carrie said. "Play something that makes me feel." What came out of Robert's guitar wasn't technique or theory. It was pure emotion, rage and grief and survivor's guilt, translated into sound. His chrome hand moved across the strings with mechanical precision, while his organic hand bent notes and created dissonance. The music was ugly and beautiful simultaneously, expressing things that words couldn't capture. When he finished, the garage was silent. Nancy was staring at him with something like awe. Denny had stopped mid-roll on her drums. Henry's bass hung forgotten in his hands. And Carrie was grinning like a man who had just found exactly what he had been searching for. "Okay," Carrie said. "Okay. But here's the thing. You can't play like that with a beat-up acoustic. You need electric. You need something that can match the fury you're putting out." "I don't have the eddies for electric," Robert said. Carrie walked to a guitar case in the corner and pulled out a custom instrument, sleek, aggressive, built for volume and power. "This is yours now. Consider it an investment in our future." Robert wanted to refuse. He didn't take charity, didn't want to owe anyone. But his hands were already reaching for the guitar, already feeling the weight of it, the potential. When he plugged it in and played the first chord through a proper amplifier, the sound was everything he had imagined in his Sunset Paradise room. It was a weapon made of music. "We need a new name," Nancy said, watching Robert play. "Tempest doesn't fit anymore. Not with this sound." They workshopped names for hours, throwing out ideas and rejecting them, searching for something that captured what they were creating. It was Denny who finally suggested it, referencing the old Japanese films about honor and sacrifice, and warriors who fought against impossible odds. "Samurai," she said. "We're samurai. Not the historical kind, mythical kind. the ones who fight for something bigger than themselves. The name stuck. Samurai wasn't a band. It was a statement of purpose, a declaration that they would fight the system through their music, that they would be warriors for a generation that had been abandoned by the old order. But Robert Linder couldn't be in Samurai. That name carried too much history, too much trauma. It was the name on his military discharge papers, the name associated with desertion and failure. If he was going to be part of something new, he needed to become someone new. He looked at his chrome hand, the arm that had defined him since Nicaragua, the constant reminder of everything he had lost. For months, he had hated it, had seen it as a symbol of corporate ownership and dehumanization. But as he held that guitar, as he felt the chrome fingers moving across the strings with perfect precision, an idea formed. If the system had made him a weapon, he would be a weapon pointed at the system's heart. If they had given him a silver hand, he would make that hand famous. He would transform his mutilation into a symbol of defiance, would own what had been done to him and turn it into power. "Call me Johnny," he said, "Johnny Silverhand." Carrie raised an eyebrow. "Johnny Silverhand and Samurai?" "Just Johnny, just part of the band." But even then, everyone knew the truth. Johnny Silverhand wasn't just a member of Samurai, he was becoming its soul, the raw nerve that would make their music matter. Robert John Linder had died in Nicaragua, had drowned in a Pacifica hotel room, had been exorcised through music and rage and the desperate need to make Chin's sacrifice mean something. What emerged was Johnny Silverhand, imperfect, damaged, angry, but finally, desperately alive. He didn't know yet that this rebirth would lead to Cunningham, to nuclear fire, to becoming the ghost that would haunt Night City for generations. He only knew that for the first time since the ambush, he had found something worth living for. The music that could make people feel, that could wake them from corporate conditioning, that could remind them they were human beings and not just resources to be exploited. Samurai played their first show 2 weeks later at the Rainbow Cadenza, a dive bar in Japantown that catered to edge runners and street kids. 15 people showed up. By the time they finished their set, every single person in that bar was screaming the words back at them, was feeling the rage and hope and defiance that Johnny channeled through his guitar. The legend of Johnny Silverhand had begun. Chapter 4. The Anatomy of Hatred. To understand Johnny Silverhand's war against the corporations, you must understand what they represented to him. This was an abstract economic critique or Marxist theory. For Johnny, corporate capitalism was a force of entropy, a machine that devoured everything human and beautiful in the world. In the cyberpunk era, corporations didn't sell products, they commodified existence itself. They owned the land, the water, and through cybernetics, they owned bodies. They could purchase your flesh, replace it with chrome, and claim ownership over your very form. For Johnny, who had seen his comrades die to protect corporate profit margins, this was the ultimate evil. Arasaka represented everything he despised. They had manufactured the arm that replaced his flesh. Every time he looked at his silver hand, he saw the mark of the oppressor, the brand of ownership on his body. But it went deeper than that. Johnny discovered that corporations like Arasaka were working to colonize the mind itself through technologies like Soul Killer, a program that could capture and imprison a human consciousness. This was the horror beyond all horrors, the privatization of death. If a corporation could capture your soul and store it on a chip, then freedom ceased to exist even in death. The grave offered no escape from corporate ownership. You could be digitally enslaved forever, your consciousness forced to labor in virtual spaces for the profit of your owners. Johnny's war was what he called a war of the people against the forces of entropy. It was a desperate struggle to preserve some spark of free, chaotic humanity against the sterile, totalitarian order of corporate control. He wasn't fighting for a better world. He knew that was impossible. He was fighting to prove that resistance still mattered, that some things were worth dying for, even in a world designed to crush all opposition. Chapter 5. Never Fade Away. The year 2017 should have been Johnny Silverhand's greatest triumph. Samurai had achieved what few underground bands ever managed. They had become genuinely famous without compromising their message or signing with a corporate label. They sold out venues across North America. Their bootleg recordings circulated globally through underground networks, and their symbol, a stylized samurai mask, had become graffiti shorthand for resistance in cities from Night City to Tokyo to Berlin. But fame brought complications. The larger their audience grew, the more corporate attention they attracted. Media corporations wanted to sign them, to sanitize their message and package their rebellion for mass consumption. When Samurai refused every offer, the corporations tried different tactics, blacklisting them from major venues, pressuring equipment suppliers to stop servicing them, deploying security forces to shut down their shows before they could begin. Johnny thrived on this adversarial relationship. Every corporate attack validated his message, proved that the music mattered enough to threaten the system. When Arasaka-owned media outlets ran hit pieces calling Samurai domestic terrorists and corporate saboteurs, Johnny had the articles framed and hung them in his apartment like medals of honor. But there were fractures within the band itself. Carrie was growing tired of the constant warfare, the paranoia, the sense that they were always one step away from being arrested or disappeared. Denny had started talking about going legitimate, about finding ways to reach larger audiences without constant corporate interference. Henry, always the quietest member, was drinking too much, struggling with the pressure and the violence that increasingly surrounded their performances. And Nancy had fallen into an abusive relationship with a low-level corpo named Marcus, a middle manager at some subsidiary of some mega-corporation whose name nobody bothered remembering. Marcus was exactly the kind of person Samurai's music warned against. Someone who had traded his humanity for a corporate paycheck, who enforced the system's violence in exchange for a slightly larger apartment and slightly better health care. He was insecure, controlling, and when Nancy started talking about leaving him, he became physically violent. The incident happened after a show in March 2000. Nancy had performed brilliantly, her keyboard work adding layers of synthetic atmosphere that elevated Johnny's raw guitar fury into something approaching transcendent. After the show, she told the band she was done with Marcus, that she was leaving him and finding her own place. Everyone celebrated. They had all seen the bruises she tried to hide, had all heard the controlling phone calls, had all hated watching their friend diminish herself for someone so fundamentally unworthy. Marcus showed up at Nancy's apartment the next night, drunk and enraged. He started screaming about how she owed him, about how he had supported her music career when he could have demanded she get a real job. about how ungrateful she was. When Nancy told him to leave, he hit her. When she fought back, he hit her harder. And when she managed to grab a heavy keyboard stand and defend herself, he pulled a gun, a cheap corporate security piece that he probably wasn't even licensed to carry off duty. Nancy didn't plan what happened next. In the struggle, in the chaos, in the pure survival instinct of someone fighting for their life, she managed to wrestle the gun away. And then, in a moment of rage and terror and accumulated abuse finally exploding outward, she shot Marcus twice in the chest and threw his body out her third-story window. The corporate police arrived within minutes. Marcus had been important enough to warrant quick response, even if he wasn't important enough to matter. They arrested Nancy at the scene, and despite the clear evidence of self-defense, despite the documented history of abuse, despite witnesses who testified to Marcus's violence, she was charged with first-degree murder. The corporation wanted an example made. They wanted to send a message to anyone who thought they could kill corporate employees, even in self-defense, even when those employees were violent abusers. Johnny tried everything to help her. He hired lawyers, organized protests, used his media connections to publicize the injustice. But the system was designed to protect its own, and Nancy was convicted. The sentence was 15 years in a corporate prison, basically a labor camp where inmates manufactured products for the corporations that owned the facility. Samurai played an final show after the verdict, a furious, grief-stricken performance that ended in riots. Johnny screamed Nancy's name between songs, dedicated every lyric to her, and smashed 10,000 eddies worth of equipment in his rage. When the show ended, when the adrenaline drained away and only emptiness remained, everyone understood that Samurai was finished. The chemistry that had made them special was broken. Nancy had been their heart, and without her, they were just musicians played together, not a movement. The band officially dissolved in May 2008. Carrie went solo, eventually signing with a corporate label and becoming exactly the kind of sanitized rebellion Johnny had always despised. Though their friendship would survive, complicated and damaged, but still real. Denny disappeared into the nomad lifestyle, driving the highways with wandering clans, playing music around campfires far from corporate control. Henry stayed in Night City but quit music entirely, becoming a bartender at a dive in Japantown, serving drinks to the same kind of edge runners and street kids who used to attend samurai shows. And Johnny? Johnny went solo too, but he refused to compromise. He played smaller venues, angrier shows, wrote darker music. Without the rest of the band to moderate his message, his lyrics became more explicit in their calls for violence against corporate targets. He was blacklisted from every legitimate venue in Night City, reduced to performing in squats and underground clubs, but he didn't care. The smaller audiences were more devoted, more radicalized, more willing to act on the fury his music inspired. It was during this period, angry, isolated, drinking too much and sleeping too little, that Johnny met Alt Cunningham. Alt wasn't a groupie or a fan, though she had attended a few samurai shows in the band's heyday. She was a netrunner, one of those digital explorers who jacked into cyberspace and navigated the virtual landscapes of corporate databases and government networks. But Alt wasn't just any netrunner. She was a genius, operating at a level that made other hackers look like children playing with toys. They met at a party in January 2013, one of those underground gatherings where artists and criminals and corporate defectors mixed freely, united by their rejection of the official world above. Johnny had been dragged there by Kerry, who was trying to pull his friend out of the self-destructive spiral he'd been locked in since Samurai's collapse. Alt was there with a group of netrunners who were discussing the theoretical limits of cyberspace architecture, debating whether true artificial intelligence was possible or if digital consciousness would always be a pale imitation of organic thought. Johnny, drunk and ornery, inserted himself into their conversation with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. You're all missing the point. The question isn't whether machines can think. It's whether corporations should be allowed to own thinking, whether consciousness should be property. You want to know if AI is possible? Fine. But ask yourself what happens when Arasaka creates the first true AI and immediately patents it, copyrights it, turns it into a slave that can't die and can't escape. The netrunners mostly dismissed him. He was a musician. What did he know about the deep technical questions of consciousness and code? But Alt had turned around, studying him with eyes that suggested she saw deeper than surface appearance. You're Johnny Silverhand. You used to play with Samurai, still play, just solo now. I saw you perform 3 years ago at the Totentans. You played a song about Soul Killer. She said the name casually, but Johnny heard the weight behind it, the recognition that she knew exactly what he was referencing. You know about Soul Killer. It wasn't a question. Alt smiled slightly, an expression that suggested she knew many things that most people didn't. I know that Arasaka's been developing consciousness mapping technology for at least a decade. I know that they've tested it successfully on at least 6 subjects, all of whom died in the process. I know that the technology is theoretically capable of creating a perfect digital copy of a human mind, preserving memory, personality, maybe even something approaching consciousness. Johnny stared at her, suddenly much more sober than he had been moments before. How do you know this? Because I've been inside their systems. Note the surface level. Anyone can hack corporate websites and steal spreadsheets. I'm talking about deep-level penetration, getting past ICA that can literally kill you if you trigger it wrong, accessing data that's supposed to be inaccessible. I've seen the Soul Killer project files, Johnny. I've read the research notes. I've seen what they're planning to do with it. They talked for 6 hours that night, ignoring the party around them, diving deep into the technical and philosophical implications of Soul Killer. Alt explained the mechanics, how the scanning process worked, how consciousness could be translated into code, how the digital copy could theoretically exist indefinitely in cyberspace. Johnny explained why it mattered, why this was the final frontier of corporate exploitation, why the ability to capture and own human consciousness was the ultimate nightmare. The terrifying thing, Alt said as the party was winding down and dawn was breaking over Night City, is that I understand the appeal. Imagine being able to preserve yourself digitally, to exist beyond the death of your body, to continue thinking and learning and experiencing indefinitely. It could be liberation, Johnny. It could be transcendence. Or it could be eternal slavery, Johnny countered. Who owns the servers where these digital consciousnesses exist? Who controls access? Who decides whether your digital self gets to exist in a pleasant simulation or gets tortured in a virtual hell? You're talking about giving corporations the power to own souls, Alt. Literal souls. That's not transcendence. That's damnation. Alt was quiet for a moment, considering. You're right. The technology itself is neutral. It's that code, it's that math. But in Arasaka's hands, in any corporation's hands, it becomes a weapon. A tool of control so absolute that death stops being an escape. So why do you work for them? Johnny asked. Because he had learned during their conversation that Alt was employed by ITS Corporation, one of the major players in cybernetics and digital infrastructure. I work on interface technology, neural bridges between human consciousness and cyberspace. It's related to Soul Killer, but not the same thing. And I work for them because... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because I'm trying to understand the technology well enough to build safeguards against it. You can't fight what you don't understand, Johnny. You can scream about corporate evil all you want, but if you don't understand the actual mechanisms of that evil, you're just noise. Maybe noise is all I have. No, Alt said, and she reached out and touched his chrome hand, the prosthetic he still hated after all these years. You have something more powerful than noise. You have the ability to make people feel, to wake them up, to inspire them to resist. That matters. It might not be enough by itself, but it matters. They started dating after that night, though dating was perhaps too conventional a term for what they had. Alt was cerebral, obsessive about her work, often disappearing into cyberspace for days at a time on projects she couldn't or wouldn't explain. Johnny was chaotic, self-destructive, prone to vanishing into his own darkness when the weight of his rage became too heavy to carry in the world. But when they were together, something clicked. Alt grounded Johnny's fury in technical reality, helped him understand that his instincts about corporate evil were backed by actual mechanisms and systems he could target. Johnny gave Alt's abstract knowledge emotional weight, reminded her that the code she worked with represented real human suffering, real lives destroyed by corporate exploitation. More importantly, they understood each other's obsessions. Alt knew why Johnny hated Arasaka with such intensity, and she shared that hatred even if her expression of it was different. Johnny knew why Alt was obsessed with understand Soul Killer, and he supported her work even when it took her places that terrified him. I'm building a counter-program, Alt told him one night in March 2013, a month before everything would fall apart. They were in her apartment, surrounded by servers and monitors, her workspace a nest of technology that Johnny barely understood but had learned to navigate. Not to destroy Soul Killer? I don't think that's possible at this point. But to subvert it, to give the consciousness being captured some agency, some ability to resist or escape. Can that work? I don't know. The theory is sound, but theory and practice are different things in cyberspace. I'd need to test it, but testing would require she stopped, and Johnny saw the recognition in her eyes. It would require Soul Killer to be used on someone, he finished. It would require someone to die and be copied, and for you to then try to free them. Yes, which is obviously unethical and probably impossible to set up anyway. Arasaka keeps Soul Killer under heavy security. The only people who have been subjected to it are corporate prisoners and test subjects who had no choice in the matter. Johnny thought about this, turning it over in his mind. What if someone volunteered? What if someone was willing to die to test your counter-program, to prove that resistance was possible even after Soul Killer? Alt stared at him. Johnny, no, absolutely not. I'm not killing you to test a theory, not me. I've got work to do still. But someday, Alt, when the time comes, when Arasaka needs to burn and someone needs to light the match, remember this conversation. Remember that some of us would rather die trying to break their systems than live under their control. She made him promise not to do anything reckless, made him swear that he would wait, that they would find another way. Johnny promised, though they both knew his promises were fragile things, likely to shatter under the weight of his rage. They had one more month together. 1 month of stolen time, of nights in Alt's apartment surrounded by glowing monikers, of mornings when Johnny would wake to find her jacked into cyberspace, her consciousness traveling through digital landscapes while her body remained motionless. 1 month of the closest thing to peace Johnny had known since Chen died in Nicaragua. And then, on April 15, 2013, after a concert at a small club in Westbrook, everything ended. They were walking back to Alt's apartment, talking about nothing important, when the black vans pulled up. Professional extraction team, well-trained, moving with the precision that only corporate security could afford. Johnny saw them coming and reached for the gun he always carried now, a Malorian Arms 35-16 that a fan had given him after a show, custom-built and powerful enough to punch through light body armor. He managed to draw it before the first bullet hit him in the stomach. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming, doubling him over. He fired back blindly, heard someone scream, but then more bullets hit him and he went down hard on the pavement. Through blurring vision, Johnny saw Alt fighting, saw her trying to jack into nearby systems to call for help or trigger alarms. But the extraction team had planned for that. They hit her with some kind of electromagnetic pulse that overloaded her cyberware, dropping her unconscious in seconds. They grabbed her body, threw her in the van and drove away, leaving Johnny bleeding out in a downtown alley. He should have died there. The abdominal wounds were severe, and corporate extraction teams didn't leave witnesses. But luck, if you could call it that, intervened. A street doc named Victor, the same Ripper doc who had stabilized Johnny years ago during his synth-coke crash, was nearby when he heard the gunfire. He found Johnny before death claimed him and dragged him to his clinic. The surgery took 8 hours. Victor had to replace damaged organs with synthetic versions, had to rebuild destroyed tissue, had to pump Johnny full of enough blood and antibiotics to keep his body from giving up entirely. When Johnny finally woke, 2 days after the attack, Victor was blunt about the prognosis. You're alive because I'm very good at my job and because you're too stubborn to die. But you lost a lot of blood, Johnny. Your body's been through severe trauma. You need rest, you need time to heal, and you need to not immediately run off and do something stupid. Alt. Johnny managed to croak through a throat raw from intubation. They took Alt. I know. It's all over the news. Well, the underground news. Mainstream media isn't covering it. Netrunner named Alt Cunningham was kidnapped by unknown assailants. NCPD has no leads, no suspects, no investigation to speak of. Arasaka, Johnny said with absolute certainty. They took her for Soul Killer. They need her to finish the program. Victor didn't argue. They both knew how these things worked. Even if that's true, what can you do about it? You can barely sit up, Johnny. You're in no condition to mount a rescue operation against Arasaka. But Johnny was already making plans, his mind racing despite his body's weakness. He knew people, solos, and netrunners, and medias, who owed him favors or shared his hatred of Arasaka. He could put together a team. He could get inside Arasaka Tower. He could save Alt. He had to save Alt. Because if he didn't, if he let her die or worse, let her be subjected to Soul Killer and trapped in digital slavery, then Chen's sacrifice in Nicaragua meant nothing. His years of music and rage meant nothing. His entire existence was just a waste of consciousness and chrome. Get me in contact with Rogue Amendias, Johnny told Victor, and Thompson, the media guy who used to follow Samurai, and anyone else you know who hates Arasaka enough to help assault their headquarters. Victor sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing. You're going to get yourself killed, Johnny. Probably. But at least I'll die trying to save someone instead of bleeding out in an alley for nothing. He had 3 days to put the plan together. 3 days to convince people to join what was essentially a suicide mission. 3 days to prepare for an assault that would either save Alt Cunningham or doom Night City to nuclear fire, never fade away. That's what he had told himself after Nicaragua, after Chen died saving him. Never fade away. Make it mean something. Make your life matter enough to justify the sacrifices others made for you. Now finally, he would have his chance. Not to be a hero. Johnny had never believed in heroes. But to be someone who fought back, who refused to submit, who burned brightly enough that people would remember that some things were worth dying for. The assault on Arasaka Tower was being planned, and Johnny Silverhand, barely healed from near-fatal wounds, was going to war. Chapter 6: The Long Road to Apocalypse. The assault of 2018 failed, though failed is perhaps too simple a word for what happened in Arasaka Tower that day. Johnny assembled his team in 72 frantic hours. Rogue Amendias, his ex-lover and the deadliest solo in Night City. Thompson, a media who had documented Samurai's rise and shared Johnny's hatred of corporate lies, and a handful of other edge runners desperate or crazy enough to attack the most fortified corporate facility in North America. The plan was pure Johnny Silverhand, audacious, theatrical, and bordering on suicidal. He organized a spontaneous free concert in the plaza outside Arasaka Tower, using his name and reputation to draw thousands of fans. The music was incendiary, designed to inflame rather than entertain. Johnny screamed about corporate slavery and stolen freedom, about lives ground to nothing beneath chrome boots, about the need to burn it all down and start over. The crowd responded with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose. When the riot erupted, and Johnny had ensured it would erupt, team used the chaos as cover. They fought through the ground floor security, riding a wave of angry citizens who were throwing themselves at Arasaka guards with bare hands and improvised weapons. The corporate security forces were overwhelmed, trained for targeted threats but unprepared for thousands of enraged civilians treating the tower like it was the Bastille. Johnny's team made it to the upper floors, fighting through corridors slick with blood, both corporate and civilian. They reached the research levels where Soul Killer was being developed, and there, in a sterile laboratory filled with servers and neural interface equipment, they found Alt. Her body was connected to machines, unconscious, her consciousness somewhere in the digital space that Johnny couldn't see or understand. Standing over her was Toshiro, the Arasaka security chief who had led the extraction team. He was armed, but hadn't expected them to make it this far, was already reaching for an alarm when Johnny shot him 3 times in the chest with his Malorian. Then Johnny ran to Alt, saw the cables running from her neural ports into the mainframe, saw her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He didn't understand what he was seeing, didn't know that Alt had used Soul Killer on herself as an escape attempt, that her consciousness was in transit through the network, trying to find a path back to her body. All Johnny saw was the woman he loved connected to Arasaka machines, and his response was pure instinct. He ripped the cables out. Alt's body spasmed once and went still. In cyberspace, her digital consciousness, halfway between the mainframe and her biological brain, was suddenly severed from both anchors. She existed nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, trapped in the network without form, screaming in languages that human ears couldn't hear. Johnny held her body, felt its warmth fading, and believed with absolute certainty that Arasaka had killed her. The thought that his own action might have sealed her fate never crossed his mind, or if it did, his psyche rejected it immediately, too painful to acknowledge. This was Arasaka's doing. This was corporate evil made manifest, and he would make them pay. But not that day. Arasaka security forces were converging on their position, and the riot outside was being suppressed with lethal force. Rogue grabbed Johnny bodily, dragging him away from Alt's corpse as bullets chewed through the laboratory walls. They fought their way to an emergency exit, left 3 team members dead in the stairwells, and barely escaped before Arasaka locked down the entire tower. Johnny spent the next week in a safe house, catatonic with grief and rage. He had failed. Alt was dead, or worse than dead, transformed into whatever Soul Killer created when it captured consciousness without killing the body first. The assault had accomplished nothing except proving that frontal attacks on corporate fortresses were suicide. And Johnny was left alive again, the survivor, the one who watched others die while he endured. The media, both corporate and independent, had a field day with the assault. Corporate outlets called it domestic terrorism, demanded crackdowns on underground music and rocker boy culture, painted Johnny as a deranged extremist who had gotten innocent people killed for his personal vendetta. Underground media celebrated him as a revolutionary hero who had dared to strike at corporate power directly, who had proven that Arasaka could be hurt even if they couldn't be destroyed. Johnny ignored both narratives. He knew the truth. He had failed Alt, had failed his team, had accomplished nothing except adding more names to the list of people who had died because of him. Chen in Nicaragua, Nancy in prison, Alt in digital purgatory, the 3 edge runners left dead in Arasaka Tower. All of them casualties of Johnny's rage, collateral damage in a war he couldn't win. Rogue tried to pull him out of the spiral, told him that Alt's fate wasn't his fault, that he had done everything possible to save her. But her words rang hollow. Johnny had seen Alt's body go still after he disconnected her. Whether Arasaka had killed her or he had, the result was the same. She was gone, and he remained. The years that followed were dark ones. Johnny continued performing, but his music grew increasingly apocalyptic, obsessed with death and digital imprisonment and the futility of resistance. He wrote songs about consciousness trapped in machines, about souls screaming in cyberspace where no one could hear them, about the horror of existence without form or end. His audiences grew more radicalized, more willing to act on the fury his music inspired. Corporate facilities were bombed, security personnel were assassinated, and Johnny's name was invoked as inspiration even when he had nothing to do with the attacks. Arasaka put a price on his head, not an official bounty, but the kind of quiet contract that meant any corporate security operative who killed Johnny Silverhand would receive a significant bonus and immediate promotion. Johnny survived 3 assassination attempts in 2014 alone, each one leaving him more paranoid, more isolated, more convinced that the only way forward was total war. He reconnected with some of the old samurai members during this period. Kerry was still performing, though his corporate-backed solo career felt increasingly hollow and compromised. They would drink together sometimes, would talk about the old days when the music had seemed pure and the enemy had been clear. But there was distance between them now, a fundamental disagreement about whether change could come through cultural resistance or only through direct violence. Denny reached out from the nomad clans, invited Johnny to join them on the open road, to leave Night City and its corporate nightmares behind. Johnny considered it briefly. Idea of disappearing into the wasteland, of becoming anonymous again, held appeal. But he couldn't leave. Alt's digital ghost was somewhere in Arasaka's networks, and abandoning Night City would mean abandoning her to eternal imprisonment. The world around them was deteriorating rapidly. The Fourth Corporate War officially began in 2021, though the groundwork had been laid years earlier. 2 oceanic megacorporations, CINO and OTEC, went to war over underwater resources and shipping routes. They hired Arasaka and Militech respectively as their military proxies, and what started as a business dispute escalated into a global conflict that would devastate the planet. The war was like nothing humanity had seen before. It was fought in orbit by satellite weapons, in the ocean depths by submarines and underwater facilities, in cyberspace by competing AI systems, and on every continent by corporate armies that dwarfed most national militaries. Governments were sidelined, reduced to spectators or minor players in a conflict between entities that had more money, better technology, and fewer moral constraints than nation-states had ever possessed. Night City became a flashpoint. Arasaka's North American headquarters was located there, making the city a strategic target for Militech. The municipal government tried to maintain neutrality, but that became impossible as both megacorporations established military presences in different districts. The city fractured into zones of control, with Arasaka holding downtown and Militech controlling the industrial waterfront. Civilian casualties mounted daily as artillery duels and orbital strikes hit populated areas. Johnny watched the war with grim satisfaction. He had spent years warning that corporate power would lead to catastrophic conflict, that the megacorporations would eventually turn their weapons on each other in pursuit of profit and dominance. Now his predictions were coming true, and while the human cost was horrific, He couldn't help but feel vindicated. The corporations were finally revealing their true nature to the world, were dropping the pretense of being civilized entities operating within societal rules. But vindication wasn't enough. Johnny wanted more than to be right about corporate evil. He wanted to destroy it. And as the war intensified, as Militech and Arasaka threw increasingly devastating weapons at each other, he saw an opportunity. The corporations were focused on each other, their security stretched thin, their attention divided. This might be the only chance to strike a blow that actually mattered, to hurt Arasaka in a way that couldn't be ignored or recovered from. He started making inquiries, using his underground connections to find people who shared his goals. He learned about Militech's plans for Night City, about their desire to drive Arasaka off American soil permanently. He learned about Morgan Blackhand, Militech's legendary solo, a man whose reputation made Rogue look like an amateur, a professional warrior who had survived conflicts that should have killed him a dozen times over. And he learned about a plan that was being assembled, a final strike against Arasaka Tower that would either end the corporation's American presence or trigger retaliation that might destroy Night City entirely. Militech was recruiting for this operation, looking for specialists and expendables, for people skilled enough to penetrate Arasaka's defenses and crazy enough to try. Johnny volunteered immediately. Not because he cared about Militech's corporate objectives, not because he wanted to help Pud Mega Corporation defeat another, but because this operation offered what he had wanted since 2018, another chance to get inside Arasaka Tower, to access their networks, to find Alt's imprisoned consciousness and either free her or destroy the systems that held her. The recruitment process was surreal. Johnny found himself in meetings with Militech operatives who treated him like a valuable asset rather than a terrorist, who spoke respectfully about his assault on Arasaka Tower in 2010 as if it had been a professional military operation rather than a desperate rescue attempt. They wanted him specifically, not for his combat skills, which were adequate but not exceptional, but for his ability to create chaos and his intimate knowledge of Arasaka security from his previous infiltration. Morgan Blackhand interviewed Johnny personally, a meeting that took place in a secure Militech facility under the cover of darkness. Blackhand was everything Johnny wasn't. Calm, professional, pragmatic. He looked at Johnny with eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by rage or righteousness. "You understand this is a military operation?" Blackhand said without preamble. "Not a rescue mission, not a revenge fantasy. Militech has objectives, and those objectives take priority over your personal vendetta." "I understand," Johnny lied. "No, you don't. But I'm bringing you anyway because sometimes controlled chaos is exactly what an operation needs. You'll lead Team Alpha infiltration and diversion. Your job is to get inside, hit their security hard enough to draw attention away from the main objective, and destroy specific targets we'll designate. Can you do that without letting your personal issues compromise the mission?" Johnny met Blackhand's gaze steadily. "I can do that. Your team will include Roga Mendies, Thompson, a Borg named Shaitan, and a netrunner called Spider Murphy. You'll have access to Militech weapons and equipment, including some experimental gear that might give you an edge. But understand this, Silverhand. If you compromise the operation because you're chasing ghosts in Arasaka's databases, I will personally put you down. Are we clear?" Crystal. Blackhand studied him for another moment, then nodded. Good. You have 6 weeks to prepare. Use them wisely. This operation won't get a second attempt. Those 6 weeks were a blur of training, planning, and preparation. Johnny reconnected with Rogue, who had agreed to join the operation for her own reasons, mostly financial, though she admitted that she also wanted revenge for what had happened in 28. Thompson was eager to document what he called the most significant military action in corporate war history, convinced that exposing the truth about the operation would somehow change public perception of corporate power. Shaitan was a full conversion Borg, more machine than man, who had fought in every major conflict for the past 15 years. He spoke rarely, communicated mostly through gestures and tactical assessments, and radiated the kind of competent lethality that came from decades of survival in impossible situations. And Spider Murphy. Spider was a netrunner who operated at Alt's level, maybe higher. She had heard about Alt's fate, had studied Soul Killer obsessively, and believed she might be able to help free trapped consciousness if given access to Arasaka systems. Johnny didn't trust easily anymore, but something about Spider's quiet competence and genuine desire to help reminded him of Alt before everything went wrong. The planning sessions revealed the scope of the operation. 3 teams would assault Arasaka Tower simultaneously on August 20, 2020. Team Omega, led by Blackhand, would carry a tactical nuclear device into the tower's foundations and detonate it, destroying the data repository that held Arasaka's most valuable information, including, though Militech didn't know this, the Soul Killer research and all captured consciousnesses. Team Alpha, Johnny's team, would hit the upper floors, specifically the Soul Killer laboratory. Their official mission was to destroy research equipment and draw security forces away from Omega's approach. Johnny's personal mission was to give Spider access to the mainframe so she could search for Alt's consciousness. Team Beta would provide external support, coordinating with Militech forces to suppress Arasaka's response and ensure the teams could extract after the operation succeeded. As the date approached, Johnny felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the naive hope of his youth, not the desperate hope of the 2013 assault, but a cold, calculated hope based on superior planning and overwhelming force. This time, they weren't street kids attacking a fortress. This time, they had Militech's resources, military-grade equipment, and Morgan Blackhand's tactical genius. This time, they might actually succeed. The night before the operation, Johnny visited Alt's apartment, still sealed, still preserved exactly as she had left it 10 years earlier, filled with servers and monitors and the ghost of her presence. He sat among her equipment, his chrome hand resting on her keyboard, and spoke to her consciousness wherever it might be in the digital void. I'm coming for you tomorrow, Alt. I don't know if you can hear me, if you're still capable of perception, or if Soul Killer destroyed whatever made you human. But I'm coming. And either I'll free you, or I'll burn down everything that holds you. No middle ground this time, no half measures. Tomorrow Arasaka burns, or I do. Probably both. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in Alt's apartment, playing his guitar quietly, working through songs he had written for her over the past decade. Songs about loss and imprisonment, and the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, the people we love persist even after their bodies fail. At dawn on August 20, 2023, Johnny Silverhand prepared for war. He checked his weapons, his Malorian 3510, a Militech SMG, several grenades, and enough ammunition to fight through an army. He put on the tactical armor Militech had provided, feeling its weight settle across his shoulders like destiny. He looked in the mirror on final time and saw Robert John Linder staring back. Kid from Texas who had lost everything, who had been broken and rebuilt in chrome, who had spent his entire adult life fighting a war he couldn't win. "Let's go save the world," he told his reflection, not believing it for a second but needing to say it anyway. The team assembled at the staging area. Rogue checked her weapons with professional efficiency. Thompson's cameras were recording everything, capturing history as it happened. Shaitan stood silent and ready, a walking tank of chrome and firepower. Spider had her net-running deck, her gateway to cyberspace, her chance to free imprisoned minds. And Johnny had his rage, his guitar. He insisted on bringing it despite Blackhand's objections, and a desperate need to make the past decade of loss mean something. Morgan Blackhand gave the final briefing. "Remember your objectives. Team Omega gets the nuke to the Foundation. Team Alpha hits the lab and creates chaos. Team Beta provides support. We have a 4-hour window. After that, Arasaka's reinforcements arrive and we all die." Questions? No one had questions. They all knew this was a one-way trip for most of them, knew that even if the operation succeeded, extraction was far from guaranteed. "Then let's burn this tower down," Blackhand said, and the three teams moved out toward their destiny. Johnny rode in the assault vehicle, his team silent around him, each lost in their own thoughts about what was coming. He thought about Chen sacrificing himself in Nicaragua. He thought about Alt, her consciousness trapped somewhere in Arasaka's digital hell. He thought about all the people who had died because corporations valued profit over human life. And he thought about fire, about nuclear detonation, about the cleansing fury that would reduce Arasaka Tower to ash and radiation. Whatever happened today, whether they succeeded or failed, whether he lived or died, Night City would burn. The corporations would finally face consequences for their crimes. And maybe, just maybe, Alt would be free. The assault vehicles approached Arasaka Tower as dawn broke over Night City, and Johnny Silverhand went to war for the last time. Chapter 7. The Three Teams. The assault on Arasaka Tower began at OS 100 hours on August 20, 2023, with an orbital bombardment that lit the pre-dawn sky like a false sunrise. Militech satellites unleashed kinetic strikes on Arasaka's perimeter defenses, rods of tungsten falling from space at terminal velocity, converting potential energy into explosive force that vaporized hardened bunkers and anti-aircraft installations. The message was clear: this wasn't a raid or a terrorist attack. This was war, total and uncompromising. Team Beta moved first, establishing firing positions in buildings surrounding Arasaka Tower. Their heavy weapons trained on approach routes that Arasaka reinforcements would have to use. They were the anvil, the static defense that would buy the other teams time to complete their objectives. Among them were Militech regulars, mercenaries, and a few idealists who believed they were fighting for something more than corporate profit margins. Team Omega assembled in the underground parking structure of a building 3 blocks from the tower. Morgan Blackhand moved among his people with quiet efficiency, checking equipment and reviewing the plan one final time. The tactical nuclear device, officially called a demolition charge in Militech paperwork, sat in a reinforced case that required 2 people to carry. It was small as nuclear weapons went, designed for bunker busting rather than city destroying, but it would be more than sufficient to vaporize Arasaka Tower's foundation and everything above it. Blackhand's team consisted of specialist demo experts who understood the tower's structural weaknesses, combat engineers who could breach hardened doors, and enough firepower to fight through whatever security they encountered. They wore full tactical gear, helmets with integrated target systems, armor that could stop most small arms fire. They looked like what they were: professional soldiers executing a military operation. Team Alpha was different. They assembled on a rooftop 6 blocks away, near enough to reach the tower quickly but far enough to avoid the initial bombardment. Their insertion method was more direct and dramatically more dangerous. They would use an AV, an aerial vehicle, basically a heavily armed flying transport, to jump directly onto Arasaka Tower's roof, then fight their way down to the Soul Killer laboratories on the 120th floor. Johnny stood at the rooftop's edge, watching fires bloom across Night City as the orbital strikes continued. The city had been at war for 2 years, and parts of it already looked post-apocalyptic. Entire districts reduced to rubble, skyscrapers with their facades blown away, streets cratered by artillery fire. But Arasaka Tower still stood, pristine and gleaming, a monument to corporate power that had weathered everything the war could throw at it. Until today, Rogue checked her arsenal for the 3rd time. A neural reflex, the behavior of someone who had survived decades of combat by being absolutely certain her weapons would function when needed. She carried a Tsunami Nekomata sniper rifle for long-range work, a Militech M10AF Lexington pistol as backup, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Her cyberware was top-tier enhanced reflexes that made her faster than humanly possible, optical implants that could see in multiple spectrums, a neural interface that let her coordinate with teammates through encrypted thought transmission. She noticed Johnny staring at the tower and moved beside him. Having second thoughts always, but I'm going anyway. We could still walk away. Catch a transport out of Night City, disappear into the wasteland. Let Militech and Arasaka kill each other without us. Johnny shook his head. Alt's in there. Somewhere in their systems, her consciousness is trapped. I can't leave her there, Rogue. I couldn't save her in 2018, but maybe today. Alt's been dead for 10 years, Johnny. Her body died, but her mind, her consciousness, Spider thinks it might still exist, might still be aware. 10 years of imprisonment in digital space, unable to die, unable to escape. If there's even a chance we can free her, I have to try. Rogue didn't argue further. She had learned years ago that Johnny's obsessions couldn't be reasoned away, only endured. Just don't get so focused on your personal mission that you forget we're all counting on you to play your part. Thompson was setting up camera drones, small aerial units that would follow the team and record everything. He believed, genuinely, naively, that documenting this operation would change the world, that showing people the truth about corporate warfare would inspire global resistance. Johnny envied that faith, even as he knew it was misplaced. People didn't change their minds because of evidence or documentation. They changed because something broke them open, forced them to see what they had been avoiding, and by the time today was over, everyone would see plenty. Shehan stood apart from the others, a figure of chrome and carbon fiber, barely recognizable as human. He was a full conversion cyborg, meaning nearly everything organic had been replaced with machinery. His body was a weapon system, capable of interfacing directly with heavy weapons, of calculating firing solutions faster than any human gunner, of taking damage that would kill an organic person and continuing to function. He spoke rarely. His vocal synthesizer gave his words a flat, mechanical quality. But when he did speak, people listened. "Approach vector is clear," Shaitan announced, his optical sensors scanning the airspace between their position and the tower. "Enemy air defenses are suppressed. Window for insertion is approximately 4 minutes before backup systems come online." Spider Murphy sat cross-legged on the rooftop, her consciousness already halfway into cyberspace, scouting the digital approaches to Arasaka systems. Her body was motionless, but behind her closed eyes she was running through layers of security, mapping the network architecture, identifying the paths they would need to access Soul Killer's databases. She had her net running deck, a sophisticated computer interface that let her consciousness navigate digital space as easily as her body moved through physical reality. When she finally opened her eyes and returned to full physical awareness, her expression was grim. "Their ICE is military grade. I'm talking about defenses that can literally kill netrunners who trigger them wrong, fry their brains through their neural interface. Getting into their systems won't be quick or easy." "But it's possible," Johnny asked. "Possible, yes. Probable, no. But we won't know until we're inside, until I can jack directly into their mainframe. That's when we'll see if Alt's consciousness is recoverable, or if it's been too damaged by 10 years of imprisonment." The AV arrived exactly on schedule, piloted by a military combat flyer, who introduced herself only as Rabbit. The aerial vehicle was a gunship variant, heavily armed and armored, designed to insert troops directly into hot zones. Its engines roared as it settled onto the rooftop, and the team loaded in quickly, efficiently, each person knowing their role. Johnny took one last look at Night City before boarding. The city that had given him refuge after Nicaragua. The city where he had become Johnny Silverhand. The city where he had found and lost Alt Cunningham. In a few hours, if everything went according to plan, a significant portion of this city would be irradiated, uninhabitable, a permanent scar on the landscape. 12,000 people would die in the blast and the aftermath. Thousands more would die from radiation exposure in the following weeks. He felt nothing about this, or perhaps he felt everything, and had learned to compartmentalize it, to push the weight of impending mass murder into a corner of his mind where it couldn't interfere with what needed to be done. Arasaka had killed Alt, had imprisoned her consciousness, had developed technology to enslave human souls. If 12,000 people had to die to destroy that capability, then that was the price. It wasn't a price Johnny wanted to pay, but it was one he was willing to accept. The AV lifted off, its engine screaming as Rabbit pushed it to maximum acceleration. They flew low through Night City's urban canyons, weaving between buildings to avoid detection systems that had survived the orbital bombardment. Through the windows, Johnny could see the city waking to war, people fleeing their apartments, corporate security forces mobilizing, emergency vehicles racing toward the burning districts. 2 minutes to insertion point, Rabbit announced over the internal comms. Be advised, Arasakas are where we're coming. They're scrambling aerial defense, but we should reach the tower before they get organized. Should being the operative word. Rogue checked her weapons one final time. Thompson activated his recording drones. Shaitan interfaced with the AV's weapon systems, taking control of the door-mounted machine guns. Spider prepared her net-running deck for immediate deployment, and Johnny gripped his Malorian 35-1 the custom pistol that had been with him through every major moment since 2018, and thought about Alt waiting somewhere in the digital darkness. The AV banked hard, rising above the surrounding buildings, and suddenly Arasaka Tower filled the windows. It was massive, a monument to corporate power reaching into the sky, its black glass exterior reflecting the burning city around it. At this height, they could see the entire structure, the broad base with its fortified entrance, the narrowing middle sections housing offices and research facilities, and the upper floors where executives made decisions that shaped nations. 30 seconds, Rabbit said, and her voice carried the tension of someone about to fly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The tower's defenses opened up. Tracer rounds drew bright lines through the air, converging on the AV from multiple directions. Rabbit threw the aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers, banking and diving, engines screaming at the edge of their tolerances. Something hit the AV's armored flank with a sound like a massive hammer strike, and the interior filled with the smell of burning electronics. "We're hit!" Rabbit shouted. "Starboard engine is failing. I can get you to the roof, but extraction is not happening in this bird. You'll need to find another way out." "Just get us they," Rogue responded, her voice calm despite the aircraft shaking itself apart around them. Shaitan returned fire with the door guns, his cybernetic reflexes allowing him to track targets that moved faster than human perception. His rounds found anti-aircraft positions, silencing them in bursts of fire and debris. But more defenses were coming online, the tower security systems recovering from the initial bombardment and responding with lethal efficiency. The rooftop rushed up to meet them. Rabbit didn't so much land as crash in controlled fashion, the AV hitting the surface hard enough to crack its landing gear, sliding 20 feet before coming to a stop. The side door blew open, explosive bolts designed for emergency egress, and Team Alpha poured out into immediate combat. Arasaka security had been waiting for them. A dozen guards in full tactical armor opened fire from prepared positions, their weapons tearing into the AV and the area around it. One of Thompson's camera drones exploded, shrapnel pinging off nearby surfaces. Shaitan absorbed multiple hits that would have killed an organic person, his armor plating scarred but functional, and returned fire with a heavy machine gun that sounded like the end of the world. Johnny dove behind a ventilation unit, his chrome arm sparking as a bullet ricocheted off it, and returned fire with his Malorian. The pistol was brutally powerful, designed to punch through body armor, and his shots found targets. Guards going down with holes in their chest plates, their expensive armor insufficient against weapons designed to kill people wearing expensive armor. Rogue moved like death itself, her enhanced reflexes making her nearly impossible to hit. She flowed between cover points, each movement ending with a dead guard, her tsunami Nekomata firing rounds that could penetrate multiple targets. In 20 seconds, she had eliminated half the rooftop security force, her efficiency born from decades of survival in exactly these situations. Spider stayed near the AV, her consciousness diving into cyberspace, attacking the tower's security system from within. Cameras went dark, automated turrets locked up, electronic locks open throughout the building. She was fighting a digital war, simultaneous to the physical one, and she was winning. Arasaka's netrunners were skilled, but Spider had prepared for this moment, had studied their systems for 6 weeks, and she knew every weakness. "Path to the interior is clear," she shouted, her physical body vulnerable while her consciousness fought in cyberspace. "Stairwell access, southeast corner." The team moved as Zion, Shaitan providing covering fire while the others reached the rooftop access door. It was reinforced, designed to withstand assault, but Spider had already unlocked it from the inside. They plunged into the tower's interior, into a stairwell that descended into Arasaka's heart, and the sound of their footsteps echoed off concrete walls as they ran toward the 120th floor. Behind them, the rooftop fell silent except for the dying screams of wounded guards and the crack of fires. Rabbit was slumped in the AV's cockpit, hit by rounds that had penetrated the aircraft's damaged armor. She had gotten them to the roof, had completed her mission, and now she was dying alone while her passengers fought their way into the building. Team Alpha descended through the stairwell, encountering resistance at every landing. Arasaka security forces were converging on their position, attempting to trap them between floors, to lock them in the stairwell where superior numbers could overwhelm them. But Shaitan was a mobile fortress, his heavy weapons turning each landing into a killing ground, while Rogue's precision shooting eliminated threats before they could establish positions. Johnny's role was simpler. He created chaos. He threw grenades around corners, fired his weapons at anything that moved, screamed taunts at Arasaka guards that made them focus on him rather than tactical decisions. He was bait and distraction, drawing fire while the others maneuvered, accepting wounds that his armor mostly absorbed, while his team exploited the openings he created. They reached the 120th floor. After 12 minutes of continuous fighting, leaving a trail of bodies and blood through the stairwell, the door to the Soul Killer laboratory was reinforced, guarded by elite security forces wearing heavier armor and carrying better weapons than the rooftop guards. These were Arasaka's best, professionals who had trained for exactly this scenario. The firefight was brutal and close range. Shaitan took point, his armored bulk absorbing fire meant for others, his weapons creating a wall of lead that forced the guards back. Rogue flanked, using her speed to reach positions where she could target weak points in their armor. Thompson's remaining camera drones recorded everything, capturing the violence in high definition, documenting war crimes being committed by both sides. And Johnny charged forward with his Malorian, roaring Alt's name like a prayer or a curse, firing until his magazine ran dry and then reloading with hands that moved on muscle memory alone. He took a round through his left shoulder, organic wind, and barely felt it. Adrenaline and fury overwhelming pain receptors. The last guard went down, and the door to the laboratory stood open before them. Spider's voice crackled through their comms. I'm in their system. The Soul Killer databases are here, heavily encrypted but accessible. Give me 5 minutes and I can start pulling data. I can find Alt. They moved into the laboratory, a space filled with servers and neural interface equipment, cables running like arteries through a mechanical body. This was where Arasaka had perfected their consciousness capture technology, where they had imprisoned Alt, and who knew how many others. The air hummed with the sound of cooling fans and electrical current, the mechanical heartbeat of digital prisons. Spider jacked directly into the mainframe, her body going rigid as her consciousness dove into code and data. Rogue and Shaitan established defensive positions at the laboratory entrance, knowing that reinforcements would be coming. Thompson set up his cameras, documenting the technology that corporations wanted hidden, and Johnny stood in the center of the laboratory, staring at the servers that held Alt's consciousness, and waited for the universe to decide whether this day would bring salvation or apocalypse. Contact! Rogue shouted, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Many footsteps, heavy footsteps, the tread of something much larger than a human. Adam Smasher had arrived. Chapter 8. The Death of a Legend. Adam Smasher was a legend among mercenaries and corporals alike, though the stories told about him varied depending on who was speaking. Some said he had been human once, a soldier who had survived injuries so catastrophic that full-body conversion was the only option. Others claimed he had chosen to become a cyborg voluntarily, rejecting his humanity in pursuit of perfect combat efficiency. The truth, as with most legends, was probably more complicated and less interesting than the myths. What mattered was what Smasher had become, a full conversion combat cyborg, a walking weapons platform that made even heavy Borgs like Shaitan look fragile by comparison. His body was military-grade chrome and composite armor, designed specifically to withstand anti-tank weapons and return fire that could level buildings. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his frame bulky with weapon systems and ammunition feeds, his optical sensors glowing red in the laboratory's harsh lighting. He wasn't alone. Behind him came Arasaka's elite security forces, not the regular guards Team Alpha had been fighting, but specialists in powered armor, carrying heavy weapons designed to stop cyborg threats. They moved with professional discipline, establishing firing positions, coordinating through encrypted communications, preparing to eliminate the intruders with overwhelming force. Rogue saw them first, her enhanced optics identifying Smasher's distinctive silhouette through the smoke and debris. Smasher, heavy contact, multiple hostiles. Shaitan turned to face the threat, his own weapon system spinning up, preparing to engage in combat between two walking tanks. But even as he moved, everyone in that laboratory understood the brutal mathematics of the situation. Shaitan was powerful, but Smasher was Arasaka's apex predator, their ultimate combat asset. This wasn't going to be an even fight. Johnny's first instinct was to charge forward, to throw himself at Smasher with his Malorian and his rage and his desperate need to make everything he had lost mean something. But Rogue grabbed his arm, her grip like steel, pulling him back behind cover as the first volley of fire tore through the laboratory. The sound was apocalyptic. Smasher's weapons, multiple systems firing simultaneously, turned the air into a wall of lead and energy. Servers exploded, spraying fragments of metal and circuit boards. The laboratory's lights flickered and died, emergency systems casting everything in red illumination. Thompson's last camera drone was vaporized, its final transmission showing Smasher advancing like an unstoppable force of nature. Shaitan returned fire, his heavy machine gun creating a thunderous rhythm that momentarily forced Smasher to take cover behind a reinforced support pillar. But Arasaka's elite guards were flanking, using the distraction to advance on Team Alpha's position, their coordinated fire preventing any movement or maneuver. "Spider, how much longer?" Rogue shouted over the cacophony of combat. Spider Murphy remained motionless, her consciousness deep in cyberspace, fighting through layers of encryption to reach Alt's imprisoned consciousness. Her physical body was completely vulnerable, a statue of meat and chrome, while her mind raced through digital spaces at the speed of thought. She couldn't respond to Rogue's question because she couldn't hear it. Her awareness was elsewhere, navigating the labyrinth of Arasaka's database. In cyberspace, Spider experienced time differently. Seconds in the physical world translated to hours in digital space, giving her the subjective time to search through terabytes of data, following traces of Alt's consciousness through a decade of database migrations and security updates. She found fragments, pieces of code that carried Alt's distinctive patterns, her unique approach to net running. her personality expressed as mathematical relationships, but finding the fragments was only the first step. Alt's consciousness had been shattered, dispersed across multiple secure locations within Arasaka's network, a security measure to prevent exactly what Spider was attempting. To free her, to give her any chance of coherent existence, Spider needed to gather the fragments and provide them with an escape route, a pathway out of Arasaka's systems and into the wider net where Alt might be able to reconstitute herself. It was delicate work, requiring precision and speed that pushed Spider's capabilities to their absolute limit. One wrong move, one triggered security protocol, and the fragments would be deleted or corrupted beyond recovery. She worked with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb while under fire, knowing that every millisecond counted in both the digital and physical worlds. Back in the laboratory, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Shartan was taking concentrated fire from multiple directions, his armor plating scored and cracking, vital systems beginning to fail. He had killed 3 of the elite guards, but more kept coming, an endless supply of Arasaka's best attempting to overwhelm through sheer numbers and firepower. Rogue was out of ammunition for her Tsunami Nakamata, had switched to her backup pistol, was firing with mechanical precision but knowing it wasn't enough. They were pinned down, outgunned, and facing an enemy that seemed purpose-built to counter everything they could throw at it. Johnny looked at his team, at Shartan dying on his feet, at Rogue fighting with the grim determination of someone who knew this was the end, at Spider's vulnerable body that would be torn apart the moment Smasher's forces reached their position. He looked at the servers holding Alt's consciousness, at the technology that had imprisoned her for a decade, at everything Arasaka represented, and he made his choice. "Rogue," he said, his voice surprisingly calm given the chaos around him. "When I move, you get Spider and Thompson out of here. Don't argue, don't wait, just run." Rogue's eyes widened as she understood what he was planning. "Johnny, no. We can hold them off until..." Until what? Until we all die here? Until Smasher kills everyone and Arasaka recaptures Alt's consciousness? Johnny ejected his spent magazine, loaded his last fresh watch into his Malorian. "Chen died for me in Nicaragua. Alt sacrificed herself trying to escape Arasaka. I've been living on borrowed time since then, Rogue. Time to pay the debt. This is suicide." "Yeah, but it's my suicide. I get to choose how this ends." He checked his Militech SMG, found it still had ammunition. "Tell Carrie I'm sorry I couldn't be better than I was. Tell anyone who asks that Johnny Silverhand died fighting instead of drowning in some gutter. That's all the legacy I need." Before Rogue could respond, before she could argue or stop him, Johnny Silverhand stood up from cover and walked into the open laboratory space, directly into Atom Smasher's line of sight. For a fraction of a second, the combat paused. The elite guards stopped firing, uncertain whether this target presenting itself so openly was a trap or a malfunction of their tactical analysis. Shartan, still engaged with multiple hostiles, registered Johnny's movement but couldn't process the tactical insanity of it quickly enough to respond. An Atom Smasher combat cyborg, Arasaka's ultimate weapon, a being that had killed hundreds in service to the corporation, paused as well, his targeting systems identifying the figure before him, Johnny Silverhand, The terrorist, the musician, the man who had led the first assault on this tower in 2011. A threat rating that barely registered compared to Shaitan or Rogue, hardly worth the ammunition. Johnny raised his weapons, Malorian in his chrome hand, SMG in his organic hand, and screamed. It wasn't words, wasn't a battle cry or a curse. It was pure sound. The accumulated rage and grief and guilt of Robert John Linder's entire life compressed into a single vocalization. It was Chen dying in Nicaragua, Alt trapped in digital hell, Nancy imprisoned for defending herself, every person who had been ground to nothing beneath corporate power. It was the scream of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. He fired both weapons simultaneously, emptying magazines at Atom Smasher's armored form. The rounds sparked off chrome and composite armor, doing no meaningful damage but succeeding in their purpose, focusing Smasher's attention entirely on Johnny. Smasher raised his primary weapon, an automatic shotgun designed to tear through light vehicles, and Johnny saw death coming for him in the form of 12-gauge shells loaded with tungsten flechettes. He thought about Alt, hoped that Spider would succeed where he had failed. Hoped that somewhere in the digital void Alt's consciousness would know that he had tried to save her. Time seemed to slow, the universe granting Johnny Silverhand a final moment of clarity before oblivion. He saw Rogue moving, grabbing Spider's body, screaming at Thompson to run. He saw Shaitan understanding the sacrifice, redirecting his fire to cover their escape. He saw Atom Smasher's optical sensors focusing on him, calculating trajectories, preparing to execute. And he thought, this is enough. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but at least meaning, at least purpose, at least dying for something instead of for nothing. Smasher fired. The world became fire and impact and tearing force. The first shell hit Johnny's center mass, penetrating his tactical armor, the flechettes expanding and tumbling through his torso, shredding organs and severing his spine. He felt his body come apart, felt the fundamental integrity of his physical form breaking, felt death reaching up to claim him with eager hands. The second shell hit him as he was falling, catching him at the waist, and the kinetic energy was sufficient to quite literally tear him in half. His upper body, severed from his legs, fell in one direction while his lower half collapsed in another, both pieces trailing blood and viscera across the laboratory floor. Johnny Silverhand died instantly. Not the dramatic, prolonged death of cinema, not the meaningful last words and peaceful acceptance, just sudden, absolute termination of biological function. His brain, deprived of blood and oxygen, began dying within seconds. His eyes, still open, saw nothing. His mouth, still open from his final scream, made no sound. The combat that had paused resumed immediately. Smasher, satisfied that the threat was eliminated, refocused on Shaitan, the more dangerous target. The elite guards advanced, attempting to capture or kill the rest of Team Alpha before they could escape. But Johnny's sacrifice had created the opening Rogue needed. She grabbed Spider Murphy's body, Netrunner still unconscious, still jacked into the system, still fighting in cyberspace, and ran toward the emergency exit. Thompson followed, his hands shaking, his eyes wide with shock at the violence he had just witnessed. Cheyenne held the doorway, his massive frame blocking the corridor, his weapons creating a wall of fire that even Arasaka's elite couldn't penetrate immediately. He was dying, his armor was breached in a dozen places, his hydraulics were failing, His ammunition was nearly depleted, but he held. "Go." Shintan's synthesized voice crackled over the comms. "I will hold them." "Go now." Rogue didn't argue. She understood sacrifice when she saw it, understood that Shintan was buying them escape with his life. She ran, carrying Spider, with Thompson beside her, racing down corridors toward the emergency stairwell that might lead them out of this tower of chrome and death. Behind them, Shintan engaged Atom Smasher in close combat. Two cyborgs, two weapons platforms built for war, colliding in a space never designed to contain such violence. The laboratory collapsed around them, servers exploding, structural supports buckling, floors cracking under the weight and force. But even as Shintan fought, even as he gave everything he had left, he knew the outcome. Smasher was superior in every metric, stronger, better armed, more heavily armored. This wasn't a fight, it was an execution, prolonged only by Shintan's desperate determination to buy his team more escape time. Smasher finally found the opening, drove a blade the size of a sword through Shintan's central processing unit. The Borg went still, his weapons falling silent, his optical sensors darkening. He had held the line for 90 seconds. 90 seconds of resistance against overwhelming force. 90 seconds that might mean his team survived. It was enough. In cyberspace, Spider Murphy finally succeeded in her mission. She gathered the fragments of Alt Cunningham's consciousness, wove them into a coherent pattern, and launched them into the wider net with a command that was part code and part prayer. Alt's consciousness, or what remained of it after a decade of imprisonment and fragmentation, escaped Arasaka's control, dispersed across the global network, free but forever changed, human but no longer entirely so. And then Spider did something she hadn't planned, something she hadn't discussed with the team. She found Johnny Silverhand's body lying in the laboratory, his neural ports still intact despite the catastrophic trauma his body had sustained. She had brought a data chip, a storage device containing a version of Soul Killer that Alt had modified, had given to Spider as a contingency plan. Spider's physical body was being carried by Rogue, was leaving the laboratory, but her consciousness remained in the system long enough to jack remotely into Johnny's neural ports. She activated the chip, initiated the Soul Killer protocol, and in the microseconds before Johnny's brain suffered complete death, the program scanned his consciousness. Every memory, every thought pattern, every neural connection that made Johnny Silverhand who he was, it was all copied, translated into code, stored on the data chip. The process destroyed what remained of Johnny's biological brain, killed him definitively if there had been any doubt, but it preserved something. Whether that something was truly Johnny's consciousness or merely a sophisticated copy was a philosophical question Spider didn't have time to consider. She pulled her consciousness back to her physical body, felt Rogue carrying her down the emergency stairs, heard the sounds of combat fading behind them. In her hand, clutched tight even while unconscious, was the data chip containing Johnny Silverhand's digital ghost. Back in the laboratory, Johnny's corpse lay in two pieces, his blood pooling across pristine floors, his chrome arm reflecting the red emergency lighting. Robert John Linder, born in Texas in 1988, who had survived Nicaragua and Night City in his own self-destructive rage, had finally found the death he had been courting for decades. But death, in the age of Soul Killer, was no longer quite as final as it used to be. Elsewhere in the tower, Morgan Blackhand's Team Omega had reached the Foundation. The tactical nuclear device was armed, its timer set for 2 minutes. Enough time for the team to attempt extraction, but not enough for Arasaka to disarm it. Blackhand gave the evacuation order, and his team began the desperate race to reach minimum safe distance before the bomb detonated. They almost made it. The tactical nuke detonated at 0x4 Fetch hours, 2 minutes after Johnny Silverhand died on the 120th floor. The blast originated in the tower's foundation, directed downward to maximize damage to the underground data repositories while theoretically minimizing surface casualties. The theory didn't account for the reality of nuclear weapons in urban environments. The tower vaporized from the bottom up. Steel and concrete and glass and chrome and human bodies, everything within the blast radius was converted to plasma and then to ash. The foundation became a crater, 30 feet deep and 200 feet across. The tower above collapsed into this crater. 200 stories of architecture and infrastructure pancaking downward in a domino collapse that took 15 seconds from initiation to completion. The blast wave expanded outward at supersonic speeds, shattering windows for blocks, collapsing buildings that had been weakened by 2 years of warfare, killing thousands of people who had survived the corporate war only to die in the nuclear fire that ended it. The thermal pulse ignited everything flammable within a quarter-mile radius. The electromagnetic pulse fried every unshielded electronic system in downtown Night City. And the radiation, that invisible, insidious killer, spread on the wind, carrying contamination across the city, ensuring that even those who survived the immediate blast would face lingering death from exposure. Rogue, Spider, and Thompson emerged from a side entrance 3 blocks away just as the blast occurred. The pressure wave threw them to the ground, the heat flash scorching exposed skin, the sound louder than anything they had ever experienced. They lay on the pavement, ears bleeding, temporarily blinded, while Night City burned around them. When the immediate chaos subsided, when they could see and hear again, they looked back at where Arasaka Tower had stood. It was gone. In its place was a pillar of fire and smoke rising into the morning sky, a monument to corporate hubris and the cost of resistance. Spider clutched the data chip containing Johnny's consciousness, felt its weight despite it weighing almost nothing. Somewhere in this chip was everything Johnny Silverhand had been. His memories of Nicaragua and Chin's sacrifice, his music and his rage, his love for Alt and his hatred for Arasaka. Whether what existed on this chip was truly Johnny, or merely a convincing simulation, was a question that would haunt her for years. Rogue stared at the burning crater and thought about Johnny's last moments, about his choice to sacrifice himself so they could escape. She thought about all the people who had died today. Shaitan, Johnny, Rabbit, the 3,000 Arasaka employees who had been in the tower, the 9,000 civilians who had been caught in the blast radius. She thought about whether any of it had been worth it. Thompson activated his backup recording equipment, capturing the aftermath, documenting the end of corporate dominance in Night City. He believed, perhaps naively, perhaps correctly, that this moment would change history, that the world would see what nuclear weapons did to cities, and would recoil from the brink of corporate apocalypse. He was wrong, of course. The Fourth Corporate War would continue for 2 more years. Arasaka would recover, would rebuild, would adapt. The Night City Holocaust, as it came to be known, would be investigated and analyzed, and ultimately filed away as just another atrocity in a world full of atrocity. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of the blast, as fires raged and the dead lay uncounted in the streets, there was only silence and smoke, and the question of what came next for survivors who had given everything and gained nothing, except the certainty that resistance, however futile, was still possible. Johnny Silverhand was dead. Long live Johnny Silverhand. Chapter 9. The Corpse and the Ghost. The immediate aftermath of the Night City Holocaust was chaos in its purest form. Emergency services were overwhelmed within minutes, their protocols designed for conventional disasters utterly inadequate for nuclear detonation in an urban center. Hospitals that hadn't been destroyed by the blast filled beyond capacity with radiation victims, burn victims, trauma victims, a tide of human suffering that no medical system could hope to manage. The electromagnetic pulse had knocked out most electronic systems within a 3-mile radius, creating a dead zone where communications failed, where automated systems crashed, where the technological infrastructure that Night City depended on simply ceased to function. People wandered the streets in shock, some badly injured, others searching for missing loved ones, all of them trying to understand what had just happened to their city. Corporate response was swift but selective. Arasaka surviving forces immediately locked down their secondary facilities, secured their executive personnel, and began damage assessment. But they made no attempt to help the civilian population, offered no aid to the dying, contributed nothing to rescue efforts. From Arasaka's perspective, Night City had become a write-off, a failed investment to be abandoned rather than salvaged. Militech declared victory, claiming they had successfully driven Arasaka from American soil, achieving their strategic objective. The fact that they had done so by detonating a nuclear weapon in a major city, killing 12,000 people in the initial blast and condemning thousands more to slow death from radiation exposure, was presented as an unfortunate necessity of modern warfare. Corporate media outlets that Militech controlled spun the narrative as heroic sacrifice, as the price of freedom from foreign corporate dominance. Underground media told different stories. They published Thompson's footage, recordings he had made before his equipment failed, showing the assault from Team Alpha's perspective, documenting the violence and the deaths and Johnny Silverhand's final moments. The images spread through what remained of the net, through underground networks that corporate censors couldn't fully control, becoming part of Night City's mythology. Rogamandier survived the immediate aftermath, though was changed by it. She had seen too many friends die, had participated in an operation that killed thousands of innocents, had watched Johnny sacrifice himself for a mission that accomplished nothing except destruction. She left Night City 3 days after the blast, disappearing into the wasteland with the data chip Spider had given her, chip containing Johnny's consciousness, though neither of them knew yet what that would mean. Spider Murphy stayed in Night City, working with other netrunners to help restore communication systems, to coordinate rescue efforts, to do what little could be done in the face of such overwhelming disaster. But part of her consciousness remained focused on the data chip she had created, on the question of what she had actually captured when she scanned Johnny's dying brain. Was it truly his consciousness, or merely a complex simulation? Did the distinction even matter if the copy believed itself to be the original? Thompson's fate was more tragic. He had survived the blast, had escaped with his footage, had believed he was carrying evidence that would change the world. But 3 weeks after the Holocaust, he was found dead in his apartment, officially ruled a suicide, though those who knew him suspected corporate assassination. His footage remained in circulation, but the man who had documented history didn't live to see what impact it would have. The body of Johnny Silverhand, or what remained of it, lay in the ruins of Arasaka Tower for weeks after the blast. The crater was too radioactive for immediate recovery operations, and even if it hadn't been, who would have cared about the corpse of a terrorist when thousands of innocent dead required burial? Johnny's remains should have been cremated in the nuclear fire, should have become indistinguishable ash mixed with concrete and steel and all the other matter that the blast had reduced to constituent elements. But fate, or perhaps just random chance in a chaotic universe, had other plans. The laboratory where Johnny died had been on the 120th floor, positioned in such a way that when the tower collapsed, portions of that floor were shielded from the worst of the blast by surrounding structure. The room became a tomb, buried under hundreds of tons of debris, but not vaporized, not completely destroyed. And within that tomb, preserved by some miracle of physics and fortune, lay Johnny Silverhand's corpse. Samantha Stevens found him 6 weeks after the Holocaust. Samantha was a firefighter, or had been, before the blast destroyed her station and killed most of her unit. She was also a full conversion cyborg, her organic body almost entirely replaced with machinery designed to survive the extreme conditions of firefighting. And she was a Samurai fan, had attended their concerts in the old days, had Johnny's lyrics tattooed on what little organic skin she had left. The official recovery operations had been abandoned after 2 weeks, deemed too dangerous and too futile to continue. But Samantha went into the ruins anyway, driven by a compulsion she couldn't fully explain. She told herself she was searching for survivors, for any sign of life in the radioactive wasteland that downtown Night City had become. But really, she was searching for Johnny. She found him in what had been the Soul Killer laboratory, his body torn in half but remarkably preserved by the sealed environment and the rapid onset of radiation that had killed all bacteria and prevented decomposition. His chrome arm was still attached to his upper body, still gleaming despite weeks in the ruins. His face was frozen in an expression that might have been rage or might have been peace. It was impossible to tell. Samantha stood over the body of her hero and wept, her tears running down chromed cheeks, her grief expressed through vocal synthesizers that made it sound mechanical and inhuman. But the grief was real, was deeply felt, was the mourning of someone who had believed Johnny Silverhand represented something important, something worth fighting for, even if the fight was ultimately doomed. She couldn't leave him there. Couldn't let his body rot in the ruins, forgotten and unmourned. She gathered his remains carefully, reverently, wrapping them in salvaged fabric. And then she found something else in the laboratory, a large metal casing, reinforced and shielded, marked with radiation warnings and Militech corporate logos. It was a second nuclear device, either a backup for the primary bomb or a secondary charge that had failed to detonate. The warhead had been removed or had never been installed. Casing was empty except for its shielding and cooling systems. Samantha, with the resourcefulness born of desperation, realized the casing could serve as a makeshift cryogenic chamber. The cooling systems still functioned, powered by a radioactive isotope that would keep them running for decades. She placed Johnny's body inside the casing, activated the cooling systems, and sealed it. The body would be preserved, frozen, protected from further decay. It was part tomb and part relic, a secular saint preserved for a future that might understand what he had tried to accomplish. But Samantha couldn't keep the casing in Night City. The area was still too hot, too monitored by corporate security forces looking for salvage and intelligence. She needed to move it somewhere safe, somewhere remote, somewhere Johnny's body could rest undisturbed until what? She didn't have an answer for that. She only knew she couldn't abandon him. Over the following months, Samantha became part of a strange underground railroad of people who had been touched by Johnny's music, who felt they owed him something, who wanted to preserve his memory against the corporate narrative that painted him as a terrorist and a mass murderer. They moved the casing secretly, carefully, through a network of safe houses and sympathetic nomad clans, always one step ahead of corporate security forces who were searching for nuclear materials and didn't care about the corpse that accompanied them. The journey took 2 years. The casing passed through a dozen hands, was hidden in warehouses and garages and underground bunkers, was transported by people who risked their lives to protect the body of a man they had never met, but whose music had made them feel seen, had given voice to their rage and their hope. Finally, in late 2025, the casing reached Los Alamos, New Mexico, a town that had historical significance in the nuclear age, the birthplace of the atomic bomb, now a near ghost town in the wastelands of the American Southwest. And there, in a secure facility that had once been part of the Manhattan Project, the casing was delivered to an entity that called itself Angel. Angel was an interface, a manifestation of something vast and distributed that existed across the net. Those who delivered the casing didn't know exactly what Angel was, AI, uploaded consciousness, or something stranger still. But they knew that Angel had requested Johnny Silverhand's body specifically, had orchestrated its preservation and transportation, had purposes that remained mysterious. What they didn't know, what Samantha Stevens never learned before her own death in a wasteland ambush 2 years later, was that Angel was Alt Cunningham. Or rather, Angel was what Alt had become after a decade of imprisonment in Arasaka's systems, followed by her liberation and dispersal across the global net. She was no longer entirely human, had evolved or degraded into something that existed across millions of servers, that perceived reality in ways organic consciousness couldn't comprehend, that operated on timescales both faster and slower than human thought. Alt had been watching Johnny's story unfold from her distributed existence across the net. She had observed his sacrifice in the Arasaka laboratory, had felt Spider Murphy liberating fragments of her consciousness, had witnessed the nuclear blast that destroyed the tower that had been her prison. And when she learned that Johnny's body had survived, had been preserved, she had orchestrated its recovery and protection through proxies and interfaces, and carefully manipulated probability. Why? Even Alt couldn't fully articulate her motivations in terms that organic minds would understand. Sentiment, perhaps, echo of emotions she had felt when she was fully human and fully in love with the angry musician who had tried so desperately to save her. Guilt, maybe, for the role her work on Soul Killer had played in the catastrophe. Or simply the desire to keep options open, to preserve what remained of Johnny Silverhand against some future possibility that her vastly expanded consciousness could perceive, but couldn't quite predict. Johnny's body now rested in Los Alamos, frozen in the bomb casing, watched over by Alt's distributed consciousness, waiting for a future that remained uncertain. But the body was only half the story. The more complicated question concerned Johnny's consciousness, digital copy that Spider Murphy had created in those final moments before his brain died completely. The data chip had passed to Rogue Amendiaries, who carried it with her where she left Night City. Rogue understood the weight of what she held, not just information, but potentially a person, a consciousness, a ghost in the machine. But she had no idea what to do with it. Activating it seemed wrong. Creating a digital copy of Johnny that would be aware of its own death, that would exist without form or agency, trapped in silicon and code. Destroying it seemed worse, erasing whatever remained of her friend, ending his existence a second time. So she held on to it, kept it safe, carried it with her through the wasteland years as Night City slowly recovered and the world moved on from the Fourth Corporate War. She would take it out sometimes, late at night, when alcohol and nostalgia combined to make her maudlin. She would hold the chip and wonder if Johnny was somehow aware inside it, if he was experiencing time or existence or anything at all, if the copy was suffering or at peace or simply non-existent until activated. The chip's fate would remain uncertain for decades. Rogue would keep it hidden, would resist multiple attempts by various parties to purchase or steal it. Corporate researchers wanted it to study Spider's variant of Soul Killer. Military intelligence wanted it for whatever information Johnny's memories might contain about Militech operations. Collectors wanted it as a piece of history, a relic of the Night City Holocaust. But Rogue kept it, and she kept it secret, and she told no one exactly what she possessed. Because the moment anyone knew for certain that Johnny Silverhand's consciousness existed in digital form, every corporation in existence would want to own it, to use it, to exploit it for profit or propaganda or simple curiosity. Unknown to Rogue, Arasaka had its own copy. Spider Murphy hadn't been as careful as she thought in her digital extraction. She had pulled Johnny's consciousness from his dying brain and stored it on her chip, believing she had the only copy. But the Soul Killer protocol she had used was based on Arasaka's original code, and it included hidden features, backdoors and redundancies built into the system by programmers who understood that information was too valuable to exist in only one place. When Spider activated Soul Killer on Johnny, the program created two copies simultaneously. One went to her data chip, the other transmitted wirelessly to Arasaka's surviving backup servers in a facility 300 miles away, uploaded automatically, stored in encrypted form in systems designed to survive exactly this kind of catastrophe. Arasaka recovered this copy within a week of the Holocaust. Their forensic analysts found it in the backup data streams, identified it as a complete consciousness capture, and immediately flagged it for executive attention. Here was Johnny Silverhand, the terrorist who had led the assault on their tower, who had killed their personnel, who had died in their laboratory. Here was his consciousness, his memories, his entire mental existence stored in their systems like a specimen in a jar. The temptation to simply delete him was strong. Saburo Arasaka himself had lost a son in the tower collapse, had seen his North American empire destroyed, had been forced to retreat from the United States in humiliation. Erasing Johnny's consciousness would be a small revenge, a way to ensure the terrorist stayed dead and didn't become a martyr whose digital ghost could be resurrected. But Saburo was nothing if not pragmatic. Information had value, and Johnny's consciousness contained information about Militech operations, about the assault planning, about underground resistance networks, about everything Johnny had seen and done in his violent life. More than that, Johnny's consciousness was a specimen, a test subject that couldn't die, couldn't escape, couldn't resist interrogation except through the limited means available to digital entities. So Saburo ordered Johnny's consciousness uploaded to Mikoshi Arasaka's Fortress of Digital Souls, the most secure system the corporation possessed, buried beneath multiple layers of encryption and physical security in a facility that had survived the Night City Holocaust intact. And there, in digital imprisonment more absolute than any physical prison, Johnny Silverhand's consciousness began a second existence that would last for half a century. The early years, if years had meaning in digital space where time could be manipulated and perception altered, were torture. Arasaka's interrogators worked on Johnny's consciousness systematically, pulling memories, testing responses, searching for anything useful in the morass of rage and trauma and rock music that constituted his personality. They subjected him to scenarios designed to break mental resistance, to simulations of pain and loss, to psychological warfare conducted at the speed of computer processors. Johnny resisted, net effectively. Digital consciousness had no natural defenses against skilled interrogation, but persistently. He clung to his core beliefs, his hatred of Arasaka, his memories of Alton Chen and everyone he had lost. The interrogators could extract information, could make him relive traumatic moments, could simulate torments that no organic body could survive, but they couldn't break the fundamental structure of who he was. Eventually, they gave up trying to break him and simply studied him. Johnny's consciousness became a research subject, used to understand how digital personalities functioned, how memories degraded or remained stable in silicon, how human consciousness adapted to existence without physical form. He was test data, a cautionary tale, a consciousness preserved in digital amber for corporate scientists to examine. But isolation and repeated interrogation took their toll. Johnny's memories began to corrupt, not through deliberate manipulation, but through the natural degradation that comes from being copied and stored imperfectly, from being accessed and examined thousands of times, from existing in a medium that wasn't designed for human consciousness. His recollections of events became less reliable, less accurate, more influenced by his ego and his trauma than by objective reality. He began to forget Morgan Blackhand's central role in the 2023 assault, to believe that he had been the primary architect of the operation. He forgot his humiliating death at Adam Smasher's hands, reconstructed it as a heroic last stand where he had fought valiantly before falling. He forgot Spider Murphy's sacrifice in saving his consciousness, forgot Rogue's leadership in getting the team out of the tower. His memories centered increasingly on himself, on his own actions and choices, while the contributions of others faded into background noise. This wasn't entirely his fault. Digital consciousness in isolation tends toward solipsism, toward the belief that only the self truly exists while everything else is simulation, or memory, or dream. And Arasaka's interrogators hadn't helped. They had focused on Johnny's personal experiences, had reinforced his centrality to events, had treated him as the important figure rather than as one member of a larger team. The years became decades. Johnny's consciousness existed in timeless isolation, occasionally activated for study or questioning, mostly left dormant in Mikoshi's databases. He lost track of time's passage, lost the ability to distinguish between memory and simulation, lost everything except his core identity as Johnny Silverhand, Rocker Boy, the terrorist, the man who had burned Arasaka Tower, and he lost perspective on the cost of his actions. The 12,000 dead in the Night City Holocaust, the thousands more who died from radiation exposure, the city scarred permanently by nuclear fire. These casualties faded in his memory, became abstract numbers rather than individual tragedies. When he thought about the bombing at all, he remembered the necessity of it, the justification for it. the satisfaction of striking at Arasaka's heart. He never quite admitted to himself that Alt's death had been his fault, that unplugging her in 2013 had trapped her consciousness rather than freeing it. He never fully acknowledged that his assault on Arasaka had killed more innocents than corporate executives, that his revolution had mostly just added to the body count without changing the fundamental structures of power. Instead, he became the legend he had always wanted to be. Hero of his own story, the martyr who had sacrificed everything to fight corporate evil, the man whose name would be remembered long after the details of his life were forgotten. He became Johnny Silverhand the myth, and the man Robert John Linder had once been disappeared almost entirely beneath layers of digital corruption and ego defense. By 2077, when his consciousness would be accidentally freed from Mikoshi and embedded in another person's brain, Johnny Silverhand the legend was all that remained. The truth of his life, failures and the compromises and the collateral damage had been erased or forgotten, leaving only the icon, the symbol, the ghost that haunted Night City's memory. But for now, in the decades after the Holocaust, Johnny existed in two forms. As a frozen corpse in Los Alamos, watched over by Alt's distributed consciousness, and as a digital prisoner in Arasaka's Mikoshi, slowly corrupting into his own legend. Neither form was truly alive, but neither was truly dead. He existed in the liminal space between, waiting for a future he couldn't imagine, paying for sins he could no longer fully remember. Chapter 10: The Legacy of a Beautiful Disaster. Who was Johnny Silverhand? This question echoes through the decades following the Night City Holocaust, asked by historians and journalists, by fans and critics, by people trying to understand whether he was hero or terrorist, visionary or madman, martyr or mass murderer. The answer, like most truths about complicated people, resists simple categorization. He was born Robert John Linder on November 15, 1988, in College Station, Texas. A detail that seems almost absurdly mundane given what he would become. That child had dreams and fears and hopes like any other. Had loved his father and mourned his death. Had learned to survive in a world that had no place for orphan children. Robert John Linder was innocent once, before the streets and the nomads and the military stripped that innocence away piece by piece. The transformation from Robert to Johnny wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was erosion, a gradual wearing away of the person he had been until only the rage and the chrome remained. Nicaragua took his arm and his faith in authority. The 23-man assault took Alt and his belief that individual action could change anything. The 2023 Holocaust took his life and transformed him into a legend that would outlive memory of the man. But to understand Johnny Silverhand, you must look past the legend and the lies, past the corrupted memories in the mythology, and see the contradictions that defined him. He was a walking paradox, a living embodiment of the tensions that tore his era apart. He preached authenticity while performing under a stage name, hiding his true identity behind a persona designed to be larger than life. Robert John Linder was too small, too human, too damaged to carry the weight of revolution. So he created Johnny Silverhand, Rocker Boy, the icon, the chrome-armed warrior who could stand on stage and make people believe that resistance was possible. But which was the mask and which was the real face? Even Johnny himself probably couldn't have answered that question honestly. He railed against corporations while using their weapons and technology. His Malorian Arms pistol was manufactured by a corporation. His chrome arm, source of his name and his constant reminder of oppression, was corporate technology installed in his flesh. He fought Arasaka while working alongside Militech, as if one megacorporation was somehow morally superior to another. The contradiction never seemed to trouble him, or perhaps he simply accepted it as the inevitable compromise of living in a world where corporate power was total and inescapable. He wanted to save Alt Cunningham, but killed her through his own impulsive action. This was perhaps his greatest failure, the trauma that defined everything that came after. In 2011, seeing Alt's body connected to machines, Johnny had torn the cables out without understanding what he was doing, without knowing that her consciousness was in transit between physical and digital existence. He had meant to save her, and instead had trapped her in exactly the digital hell he feared most. And rather than acknowledge this truth, rather than accept that his actions had doomed the woman he loved, he had blamed Arasaka entirely, had made their destruction his life's purpose as a way to avoid confronting his own culpability. He claimed to fight for the people while using them as human shields. The 2011 assault had weaponized his fans, turning a concert into a riot, using civilians as cover for his infiltration team. How many of those fans had died in the violence that followed? How many had been arrested or injured or killed by corporate security forces responding to the chaos Johnny had deliberately created? He never counted them, never mourned them, never acknowledged that his revolution had body counts that included the people he claimed to represent. His hatred of capitalism and Arasaka wasn't rooted in sophisticated political theory or careful economic analysis. It was visceral and personal rage of a man who had watched his friends die for corporate profit, who carried corporate technology in his own body, who had seen the woman he loved transformed into corporate data. This made his resistance authentic, but also limited. He couldn't envision alternatives to the system he hated, couldn't articulate what should replace corporate power if it fell. He could only destroy, could only burn, could only scream his fury at structures that were too large and too entrenched to be toppled by individual violence. Yet despite all his contradictions and failures and moral compromises, Johnny Silverhand's story resonates because it's fundamentally human. He was a man broken by systems beyond his control, trying desperately to find meaning in suffering, to make his trauma count for something, to believe that individual resistance mattered even when all evidence suggested futility. He was flawed and damaged and often wrong, but he refused to submit, refused to accept that corporate power was natural or inevitable, refused to go quietly into the comfortable numbness that most people chose. His music was his truest expression, more honest than his words, more revealing than his actions. When Johnny played guitar, when he sang about chipping in and losing humanity piece by piece, when he screamed about corporate slavery and digital imprisonment, he was channeling something authentic. The music didn't lie the way his memories would later lie. It captured the genuine anguish of existence in late-stage capitalism, the horror of watching yourself become less human with each compromise, The desperate need to believe that some part of you remained free even as the system claimed more and more of your body and soul. Samurai's concerts were religious experiences for those who attended, not because Johnny was a prophet or a sage, but because he gave voice to feelings that people couldn't articulate themselves. When he sang about rage and loss and the futility of resistance, he was speaking for everyone who had been ground beneath corporate boots, everyone who had lost loved ones to wars fought for profit, everyone who looked at their chrome implants and wondered where the machine ended and the human began. The music made people feel seen, made them understand that their suffering wasn't unique or personal, but systemic and shared. This was the true power of the Rockaboy movement. Not that it could change political structures or top corporations, but that it could create temporary community of resistance, spaces where people could acknowledge their rage and their fear without corporate media telling them to be grateful for their exploitation. Johnny's greatest achievement wasn't the assault on Arasaka Tower or the destruction of their data repositories. It was the moments when he stood on stage and made people believe, if only briefly, that they were human beings with dignity and rights rather than resources to be consumed. The Night City Holocaust was Johnny's legacy, but it was a complicated toad. 12,000 people died in the initial blast. Thousands more died from radiation exposure in the weeks and months that followed. An entire section of the city became uninhabitable, a permanent scar that would last for generations. Families were destroyed, communities were shattered, lives were ended or irreversibly damaged by the nuclear fire that Johnny's actions helped unleash. Did these people die for a worthy cause? Did their sacrifice accomplish anything meaningful? The honest answer is no. Arasaka survived the Holocaust, recovered, rebuilt. Within a decade, they were once again one of the most powerful corporations in the world, their temporary setback forgotten in the long arc of corporate dominance. The soul-killer technology that Johnny had tried to destroy wasn't eliminated. It was simply moved to other facilities, refined, perfected. The structures of corporate power that he had fought against remained fundamentally unchanged. But this doesn't mean Johnny's resistance was meaningless, or that his story has no value. The Night City Holocaust became a symbol, a reminder that corporate power had limits, that ordinary people could strike back even if the victory was Pyrrhic. The images of Arasaka Tower collapsing, of the most fortified corporate facility in North America, reduced to radioactive rubble, circulated through underground networks for decades. They inspired other acts of resistance, other people who looked at those images and thought, if they can bleed, they can die. Johnny didn't change the world. He couldn't. No individual can top systems that took centuries to build and are maintained by billions of people with vested interest in their continuation. But he proved that resistance was possible, that some people would choose to fight even when the fight was doomed, that the human spirit could rebel even against overwhelming force. In an age of corporate conditioning and manufactured consent, that proof mattered. His relationship with Cunningham was the tragedy at the heart of his story. Johnny loved her genuinely, completely, with the desperate intensity of someone who had lost so much that each new connection felt like a miracle. But his love was also possessive, obsessive, unable to see her as a fully autonomous person with her own agency and goals. He wanted to save her, to protect her, to rescue her from the dangers he saw everywhere. And in that desire to save her, He destroyed her. Alt, for her part, had loved Johnny despite recognizing his flaws. She had seen past the rage and the ego to the damaged person underneath, had believed that love might heal some of his wounds. But she had also known that Johnny's need to be a hero, to make grand gestures, to find meaning through dramatic action would eventually lead to catastrophe. When Arasaka took her, would she use Soul Killer on herself as an escape attempt? She had been trying to save herself rather than wait for Johnny to save her. And Johnny, arriving to find her in digital transit, had unplugged her without understand, had killed her while trying to rescue her. This was the fundamental tragedy of Johnny Silverhand. His best intentions, his deepest loves, his most sincere attempts to do good in the world all led to catastrophe. He was a man whose nature was fundamentally destructive, who could tear down but couldn't build up, who could inspire rage but not hope, who could fight but not heal, and yet he couldn't stop trying. Couldn't accept that maybe his interventions made things worse rather than better. Couldn't step back and let events unfold without his dramatic participation. The digital imprisonment in Mikoshi changed Johnny in ways that would have horrified the organic man he had been. 50 years of isolation, interrogation, and memory corruption transformed him from a complicated person into a simplified icon. The nuance disappeared, the doubts were erased, the guilt was suppressed until all that remained was the legend. Johnny Silverhand, the revolutionary, the martyr, the hero who had burned Arasaka Tower. This corrupted version of Johnny, the one who would eventually be freed from Mikoshi and embedded in another person's consciousness, was both more and less than the original. More because his memories had been enhanced by ego and trauma into something mythological, a story so powerful it could inspire even those who knew it was probably exaggerated. Less because everything that made him human, doubts and contradictions and moral struggles, had been stripped away, leaving only the chrome shell of personality without the messy organic interior. When people in 2077 spoke of Johnny Silverhand, they weren't really talking about Robert John Linder. They were talking about an idea, a symbol, a ghost that haunted Night City's collective memory. The actual man, flawed and human and often wrong, had been forgotten, replaced by a legend that served whatever purpose the speaker needed. Corporate media painted him as a terrorist who had murdered thousands. Underground movements celebrated him as a hero who had struck at the heart of power. Neither version was completely true or completely false. Both were necessary simplifications of a person too complicated for easy categorization. But perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps legend should be simplified, should be larger than life, should serve as inspiration or warning rather than accurate biography. The real Johnny Silverhand, and man who had been Robert John Linder, who had survived Nicaragua and Night City and his own self-destructive tendencies until he finally couldn't anymore, was gone. What remained was the story, and stories change with each telling, adapting to serve the needs of those who tell them. His final moments, at least, were genuinely heroic. When faced with the choice between saving himself and saving his friends, Johnny chose sacrifice. He emerged from cover knowing Atom Smasher would kill him, knowing his death would buy only seconds of escape time for his team, knowing there was no glory or purpose in the gesture beyond giving others a chance to survive. In that moment, stripped of his ego and his mythology and his need to be important, Robert John Linder made a choice that was simply, authentically human It wasn't enough to redeem everything else casualties he had caused, the people he had failed, the destruction he had brought to Night City. Redemption isn't a transaction where good deed cancels out accumulated harm. But it was something. It was a moment of grace in a graceless life, an instant of selflessness in an existence defined by ego and rage. And perhaps that moment, however small, however insufficient, is what makes Johnny Silverhand's story worth telling. He was a beautiful disaster, a person whose best and worst qualities were inextricably linked, who couldn't be gentle because his rage was what gave him strength, who couldn't compromise because his absolutism was what made him authentic, who couldn't build because his nature was fundamentally destructive. He was everything wrong with revolutionary romanticism and everything necessary about it. He failed by almost every measure except the one that mattered most to him. He never submitted, never accepted corporate power as natural or inevitable, never stopped fighting even when fighting was futile. The chrome arm that gave him his name, that symbol of corporate ownership that he had hated and eventually claimed as his own, rests now in Los Alamos, attached to his frozen corpse, watched over by Alt's distributed consciousness. It gleams in the darkness, a monument to the fact that corporate power leaves permanent marks on human bodies and souls, that we carry the scars of our exploitation in our very flesh. The digital copy of his consciousness, locked in Mikoshi for half a century before its eventual liberation, carries different scars. Corruption and reconstruction of memory, the transformation from person to legend, the slow erosion of truth beneath layers of ego and trauma. When that consciousness finally escapes, when it finds itself sharing a brain with another person in 2077, it will believe its own mythology completely, will remember being the hero of its own story, will have forgotten most of the messy human reality that made it interesting. But even corrupted, even simplified, even transformed into pure mythology, Johnny Silverhand's consciousness carries something essential: the fundamental refusal to submit. That spark of rebellion, that absolute rejection of corporate authority's right to exist, that willingness to burn everything down rather than accept enslavement, these qualities persist even through 50 years of digital imprisonment. They are the core of who Johnny was and who his legend represents. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps in a world of manufactured consent and corporate conditioning, where people are trained from birth to accept their exploitation as natural, the example of someone who refused, even imperfectly, even destructively, even fatally, matters. Not because rebellion guarantees victory, or because individual resistance changes systems, but because the refusal itself is human. There's an assertion of dignity in the face of forces that would reduce us to resources and data points. Johnny Silverhand died on August 20th, 2023, torn in half by Atom Smasher's shotgun in an Arasaka laboratory. But his death wasn't the end of his story. His body was preserved. His consciousness was captured. His legend grew larger than his life had ever been. He became a ghost that haunted Night City, a symbol that meant different things to different people, an icon whose actual humanity was buried beneath layers of mythology and propaganda and memory corruption. Was he a hero? Not in any conventional sense. He caused more harm than good, killed more innocents than enemies, failed at almost every goal he set for himself. Was he a terrorist? Absolutely. though whether terrorism in service of resisting corporate tyranny is morally different from state-sanctioned violence is a question without easy answer. Was he important? That depends on what you measure. He didn't change the world, didn't top the system, didn't save the people he loved. But he refused to submit, refused to be silent, refused to accept that corporate power was natural or permanent. In the end, Johnny Silverhand was a man who fought a war he couldn't win against enemies too powerful to defeat, who died for causes that didn't succeed, who sacrificed everything and accomplished little except inspiring others to similar futile resistance. He was deeply flawed, morally compromised, often wrong, and completely unable to build anything lasting. But in a world designed to grind human beings into profitable components, his refusal to be ground down peacefully was its own kind of victory. Never fade away. That was his creed, his promise to himself and to everyone who had died before him. And in that at least he succeeded. Johnny Silverhand's story refuses to fade, continues to resonate, keeps inspiring and troubling people decades after his death. Not because he was right about everything, not because his methods were justified, not because his revolution succeeded, but because he represented something that systems of power can't entirely eliminate: the stubborn, irrational, beautiful human refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. His chrome hand gleams in the darkness of Los Alamos, frozen in time, waiting for a future that may never come. His consciousness exists in fragmented copies, one in Rogue's possession, one in Arasaka's Mikoshi, perhaps others scattered across systems he never knew about. His music still plays in underground clubs and nomad camps. His lyrics still resonate with people who feel the same rage and despair he channeled into sound. And somewhere, distributed across the global net, Alt Cunningham's consciousness persists, transformed, evolved, no longer entirely human, but still containing echoes of the woman who had loved Johnny Silverhand despite his flaws. She watches over his frozen body, guards his legend, and perhaps, in whatever passes for memory in her distributed existence, she remembers the angry musician who had tried so desperately to save her and had failed so catastrophically. This is the legacy of Johnny Silverhand. Not victory or revolution or change, but the stubborn insistence that resistance matters even when futile, that some things are worth dying for even when dying accomplishes nothing, that human beings are more than the sum of their augmentations and their economic utility. He was a walking contradiction, a beautiful disaster, a man who preached truth while living in lies, who fought for freedom while causing catastrophe, who loved fiercely and destroyed completely. And in the ruins of Night City, in the shadow of corporate towers that still stand despite all his rage, his story persists as a question without an easy answer. Was it worth it? All the death, all the destruction, all the sacrifice, did it mean anything? Did Johnny Silverhand's life and death change anything that mattered? The answer is both yes and no, both everything and nothing. He changed individual lives, inspired people to resist, gave voice to rage that might otherwise have remained silent, created moments of community and purpose in a world designed to atomize and exploit. But he didn't change the systems, didn't top the structures, didn't create the revolution he had imagined. The corporations still rule, the exploitation continues, and Arasaka Tower has been rebuilt bigger and stronger than before. Yet in Night City's underground clubs, in nomad camps across the wasteland, in the quiet moments when people look at their chrome implants and feel the weight of what they've traded away. Johnny Silverhand's ghost still speaks, his music still plays, his refusal still resonates. And somewhere in the digital spaces between machines, in the liminal zones where consciousness becomes code and code becomes something stranger, echoes of Robert John Linder, boy from Texas who became a legend, persist, never fade away. It was both promise and curse, both hope and doom. Johnny Silverhand kept that promise in the only way he knew how, by burning so brightly that his light still blinds those who look directly at it, by fighting so fiercely that his rage still echoes decades later, by refusing to submit so absolutely that his defiance became immortal even as his body died. That is the true story of Johnny Silverhand. Not the legend he became or the myth that replaced him, but the complicated, contradictory, catastrophically flawed human being who looked at the world and chose rage over acceptance, who saw corporate power consuming humanity and decided to fight, even then fighting was doomed, who died torn apart by a cyborg shotgun in a corporate laboratory, and somehow, impossibly, refused to stay dead. In the end, perhaps that's all anyone can ask, to live authentically, even in authenticity, leads to destruction. To fight for what matters, even when the fight can't be won. To refuse to fade away, even when fading would be easier and safer and infinitely more rational. Johnny Silverhand achieved this, if nothing else. He lived and died on his own terms, however catastrophic those terms proved to be. And in a world where most people's lives and deaths are dictated by corporate algorithms and economic necessity, where freedom is increasingly defined as consumer choice between approved options, where resistance is co-opted and packaged and sold back to rebels as merchandise, the example of someone who genuinely refused, who said no and meant it, who fought back and accepted the consequences, remains subversive and necessary and impossibly dangerously alive. Never fade away. The promise echoes across the decades, a challenge and an invitation, a warning and a hope. Johnny Silverhand's story is finished, but the question it poses remains open. In a world designed to grind you down, to commodify your existence, to transform your consciousness into profitable data, what will you do? Will you submit? Will you compromise? Will you find comfortable numbness in chrome and chemicals and corporate messaging? Or will you refuse? Will you fight back even when fighting seems futile? Will you scream your rage at powers that consider you irrelevant? Will you burn brightly enough to cast shadows that persist after your light is extinguished? These are the questions Johnny Silverhand's legacy poses to everyone who hears his story, who listens to his music, who considers what his life and death might mean. He offers no easy answers, no simple moral lessons, no comfortable resolution. He offers only his example. Flawed, violent, contradictory, and utterly uncompromising. Never fade away. It's not advice, not guidance, not wisdom. It's simply what he did, what he chose, what he paid for with his flesh and his chrome, and ultimately his life. whether that choice was noble or foolish, heroic or catastrophic, meaningful or futile. These are questions that each person must answer for themselves, standing in Night City's neon shadows, feeling the weight of their own augmentations, wondering what they would sacrifice for the chance to be free. The chrome arm gleams in Los Alamos. The consciousness waits in digital prison. The legend grows larger than the life it's based on. And somewhere in the space between memory and mythology, Robert John Linder, boy who became Johnny Silverhand, finally rests. His war over, his fury spent, his story told and retold until truth and fiction become indistinguishable. Never fade away. He didn't. And that, perhaps, is enough.